Ladies and gentlemen, recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, it's time for Fight Night Picks with your host, Craig and Matt Allen.
A little bit of breaking news on a Monday night. And hey, if this is your first time with Fight Night Picks, A, we really appreciate you being here. And B, you can check out a lot of the content at Fight Night Picks over on Instagram, where you can vote for our Question Mark Kicks segment on Saturday's show. Question Mark Kicks, where you get a chance to recap everything from the week and get to give our final picks for the week. So, of course, we're getting ready for this card on Sunday night. We're making our picks. And that main event over there fell out yet. Islam Makhachev supposed to be taking on Rafael dos Anjos. So, Matt, I mean, we were kind of disappointed. We continued on through the night, even into today being Monday night. We were getting ready with a really big question mark in our main event. We previewed Brendan Allen, and he's taking on Sean Strickland. That's a really exciting fight, but we were just trying to speculate as to who could take that shot. Maybe it's Drew Dober. Maybe it's Beneil Dariush. Maybe it's some dark horse from 170 pounds. I know Santiago Ponzinibbio threw his name in the hat. So did Nasrat Haqparast at 155 pounds, and even Carlos Diego Ferreira. All of a sudden, boom, insert Paul Felder, company man, the guy that fought with a broken arm against Mike Perry at 170 pounds, so a split decision. And that fight is all kinds of bananas. I mean, listen, you've got RDA, the former champion, now taking on your number 7th ranked lightweight. It's an insane contest. And I mean, Matt, with these introductions to the entire breakdown prediction type of segment, we've been getting into our possible fight of the night. So let's transition it on over here, Matt, where we have Paul Felder and Rafael dos Anjos. And if we're talking about a couple of fight of the nights, one for you, one for me, to me, it's 1A, 1B, the two fights that we have. And we won't give you a B, but 1A is pretty damn good. As a main event, 5-rounder, Paul Felder coming in on short notice. Hopefully he doesn't weigh 196 pounds right now like he did on the scale that one time. But why is this fight a possible fight of the night?
Because, okay, RDA was supposed to fight Islam Makhachev, which is a good fight, and it makes sense for the division if you want to argue about that. But Paul Felder, who was kind of in a pseudo-retirement, if you will, coming out to fight the former champion on 5 days' notice, one of the cooler things you can really do in MMA. Dana White loves it when people can do things on short notice. I'm sure he loves it even more if you can go from commentating a card to then fighting in the main event the next weekend and no one knew it was going to happen. The Muay Thai of Paul Felder and the Muay Thai of RDA are going to be able to cancel each other out for the most part. The stand-up between these two is going to be insane. The volume from RDA, the power from Paul Felder. And then, of course, it really comes down to if RDA can take down Paul Felder, he has such a huge advantage on the ground. But Paul Felder's best weapons are those attacks coming up the middle. And if he can catch RDA with a big uppercut, an elbow, or a knee coming in, that's all she wrote. So just the fact that it could go either way, and we're getting such a good competitive and also just a fun fight on such short notice, I really can't say enough about this new main event.
I mean, Matt, this fight so compelling. The matchup between Islam Makhachev and Rafael dos Anjos was already a great one. I can't wait for this fight. I mean, really, stylistically, you have Dos Anjos moving down from 170. He looks absolute shred city over on Instagram, so he should be fight ready. If Paul Felder comes in at even 70%, he should make for a very competitive fight with Dos Anjos. For me, if we're talking fight of the night, we got a guy with the same last name as us. And A, Matt, a lot of people didn't know that we were brothers, so let's throw that one out there. But B,
we are.
Brendan Allen, not even a cousin. Guy out of the United States. We're still out of Canada. You can see it up there, FNP, New Brunswick, Canada. But Brendan Allen originally supposed to be taking on Ian Heinisch last weekend. That fight fell out. We were hoping maybe they put it back together because that was actually our fight of the night last week. And Brendan Allen all of a sudden gets Sean Strickland, a guy who had such a competitive fight, and actually, made it uncompetitive against Jack Marshman. He beat the wheels off of Jack Marshman in that fight. So you have Sean Strickland, your former King of the Cage middleweight champ. He's had 11 fights so far in the UFC, 8-3. You talk about the losses, really good competition. Santiago Ponzinibbio, Kamaru Usman, and then the knockout loss that sent his head into a highlight reel to Eliseu Zaleski dos Santos. But the wins, really momentous. And I mean, I look at a lot of the different ones that he's had. The one over Alex Garcia is a great one. You beat a wrestler, you come in here, take on a big guy like Brendan Allen. We'll have to see how that win or a win like that translates up to 185, but I like the improvements that he's made in his game. I love the striking that he had in the Marshman fight where we're pointing, we're going right in the center of the cage, let's go. Instead of just coasting to the end of the fight, that's the type of fight that, A, the bench boss likes to see behind the scenes with his little plexiglass in thing. He doesn't have to wear his mask. We'll stop that commentary there. But ultimately, this fight could be a fight of the night. And really, Matt, I'm looking forward to this card. It's such a great one. I mean, hey, It's been a wild past 3 weeks. I will hand you the trophy. Matt went 11-0-1 with the one draw, the Dao and Jung fight with Sam Alvey. 9-1 and 9-1. It's been a crazy run. It's been an incredible run. I was 8-2. Like I'm one pick behind you on like every single card. And people are just slagging me in the comments.
Yeah,
hey,
sounds like a loser to me.
We're putting together some incredible performances. You can check out the predictions down below in the description. You can see what the tally is for this year. I still have that prediction MVP trophy, and I have the one from last year too. But ultimately, it's been a great year. We really do appreciate everybody tuning in. About 40% of you are subscribers. The other 60% are unsubscribed. My challenge to you, subscribe now, join the team.
Nice.
Because the other thing with Fight Night Picks and what we've been able to do in this intro is just A, thank everyone, but B, Matt's coming on with Fight Night Picks full time. I can't yet, but that's the plan. But for now, Matt's coming on full time, so we're going to have more time to edit, put together graphics packages, so you can find us on the socials, at Fight Night Picks, at Craig Allen FNP, at Matt Allen FNP, and we're really looking forward to bringing you more content in the space and in the sport of MMA. Matt, I love this card. There's a lot of great additions already in just those 2 fights, but you're not going to want to miss the rest of the predictions. So you keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. Without further ado, let's get into it. Low-key banger at heavyweight. We've got Lord Kong, Don'Tale Mayes taking on Rocky Martinez. Matt, a lot of people might be down on this fight, and I can certainly understand that. For Don'Tale Mayes, he's lost his last 2 fights since coming in off of Contender Series. Had a couple of opportunities there. I mean, you look at the overall body of work, he's fought a lot of names that you might recognize. And for the man on the right-hand side of the screen, Rocky Martinez, he's coming in off of a very disappointing loss on somewhat a short notice against Alexander Romanov. And I mean, Matt, you saw what Romanov did in his last fight last weekend against Marcos Rogerio de Lima. And in the fight against Rocky Martinez, I mean, how do you get ready for a guy like Alexander Romanov? I feel like you could give most heavyweights a year or two to study tape on him, and you're going to get a different Romanov every time. He could come out with that low Muay Thai. He could come out with just straight takedowns. He could submit you with his forearm. Weird stuff from Alexander Romanov. Tough to have a good fight and look good against him. Rocky Martinez definitely didn't have that opportunity. I mean, you look at Martinez's overall body of work, 15-6-2. The level of competition, a little sparse. I mean, he has won different titles in different organizations. He's a former deep openweight champ a few years ago. I mean, he had a halfway competitive fight against Mirko Cro Cop just a couple of years ago until a forearm absolutely opened up his forehead, and that was all she wrote. But Rocky Martinez, I know you might see him walk into the cage. There might be some snickers. A lot of people think this guy's totally out of shape. But he's he's fleet of foot, and I can say that for sure. He's open fights with flying knees. He's got a really nice left hook, and he does have nice forward movement. He throws a lot more single shots than he does combinations, but he is a very technical striker when he's walking his opponents down. And for the man on the left-hand side, Don'Tale Mayes, I mean, again, you know this guy. He's come up on the Contender Series circuit. He's had fights against those recognizable names that I mentioned. The Alan Crowders, I mean, got the fight against Ricardo Prezel that got him into the UFC. A fellow rising fighter like Rocky Martinez was at one point. And then he ran into Cyril Gane, and we're talking championship level Cyril Gane. And then he had the fight against Rodrigo Nascimento where he lost both of those fights by finish, by submission. Don'Tale Mayes, mostly known for his boxing. Rocky Martinez, good takedown defense, decent takedown offense if he's fighting a striker. And we know that his striking isn't half bad. Pretty heavy on his lead leg. I think that this fight definitely has the potential to deliver, maybe end up with a performance of the night in this fight. What do you make of this one? Because it's not like either one of these guys is going to shoot into the top 15 with a win. You probably need a few more. Rocky Martinez, a little bit longer in the tooth. Obviously, quite a few more fights than Don'Tale Mayes. What do you think about this one?
So I'm going to bring everyone's expectations for this fight back down to reality. Because, and it's nothing against Rocky Martinez or Don'Tale Mayes, but you have two guys who are somewhat incomplete MMA fighters, just in regards of they have this one component of the game that they just don't really use and haven't really shown the ability to. Now with Rocky Martinez, it's tough to show off your ground game against a guy like Romanov, but that fight was one of the least competitive fights we've seen that doesn't involve Khamzat Chimaev, because what Rocky Martinez did, he went out, and I do like what you said, he has good boxing, he has good leg kicks, and he has a good level of athleticism for the looks of him. Mentioned that in a previous video. But Rocky Martinez can't defend the takedown, and once he's on his back, he has this Thiago Santos problem where Thiago Santos, we're just going to start giving new guys like their own awards and problems, but Thiago Santos doesn't move on the ground. Once his back is on the ground, he's not going to make a lot of attempts to get back up to his feet. He's got that really good first move to defend the takedown, and if you get him down, he can explode immediately. But if you get him down and can control him for any period of time and kind of get a set position, you can stall him out and just sort of prevent his movement. Roque Martinez is in the same boat, and so is Don'Tale Mayes. But here's the good news. Neither guy's going to go for the takedown. I think Roque Martinez is definitely more likely of either guy to shoot in and start using his wrestling. And not because he is this phenomenal wrestler, but when he does fight other strikers who might have a little bit of a speed advantage over him, he will resort to a little bit of the wrestling because he does have good ground and pound from top position. Don'Tale Mayes' his boxing in this fight, I do think is going to be really important because when you look at Don'Tale Mayes, yes, the grappling has been the downside of his career in the UFC, at least to this point, but he has great combinations. He is a guy who won't just throw that single shot, which is a really big problem at heavyweight, because in heavyweight, there's so many guys out there who they know they carry such great power. They're going to throw their big bomb, and if it lands, they'll win the fight, and if they don't, they'll probably lose the decision. Mayes won't rely on that one shot. He does have it. He has a really nice combinations where he won't throw everything behind every shot. It's sort of Nate Diaz-esque. Again, I'm not comparing Don'Tale Mayes to Nate Diaz, but he won't throw everything behind every shot. He'll throw a few kind of feelers out there and then put a lot behind one. I do like his boxing style. I like how he goes to the body, too. And a stat that Craig had mentioned before we had even started, we were just kind of looking at Don'Tale Mayes' career. He's really the output of his leg kicks throughout his career, and that's always something you like to see, not just specifically with the leg kicks, but just when a guy can incorporate a new technique and start using it at a high level as they progress further into their career.
The one issue I have with that, and again, this is a little bit of inside baseball, like getting ready, we'll look into the UFC stats, and I mean, again, for a guy like Don'Tale Mayes, you have a bit to go off of because you have a number of Contender Series fights, but you also have his 2 fights in the UFC. And I mean, he's a guy that on a couple of different websites, I believe it's Bronx Hills MMA is where he's listed out of. I could have a look to be sure. Bronx Hill MMA. If you actually look at it, he's training and fighting out of Jackson Wink MMA. So he definitely has a really good quality of training partner there. Obviously John Jones, but the list goes on and on out of the fighters that are there. And a guy like Brandon Gibson can definitely help out a fighter like Don'Tale Mayes, especially with his boxing, but incorporating that leg kick. The only issue I have, because we're going from single digit numbers in his first few fights, where again, he's knocking guys out, to his last 2 against Cyril Gane and Rodrigo Nascimento, is the fact that throwing a lot of leg kicks against guys that can grapple very well, that's not really the smartest thing to do. Now, I do like that he has incorporated it, and he does go to the body. Against a guy like Roque Martinez, I don't necessarily worry about that. The thing that gets a little weird in this fight is if we have a look at the odds, Don'Tale Mayes opened a -205 favorite. The line jumped to about a -180. He's now at a -190. If we have a look at his opposite, Roque Martinez, again, his debut definitely didn't go all that well. Open a +175. He's now at a +159. If we look at the total Tapology votes, Matt, at a 386, limited sample size. Again, a lot of these fights on this card just added recently. 76% going with Don'Tale Mayes, 70% saying that he's going to win the fight by knockout or TKO. Again, it's a little bit tougher than that. It's not as black and white as those numbers might indicate in this one, because again, Roque Martinez is definitely, and I don't think it's a controversial statement, the more well-rounded mixed martial artist. But Don'Tale Mayes is starting to kind of come into his own. You can see that. Less fights on his record, younger fighter. And the level of competition that Don'Tale Mayes has fought, maybe it isn't the highest level, but you recognize those names. He's got a win over Muhammad Usman, a decision win. The Michael Stipe win was huge, not Michael Stipe from, that band that one time that I'm absolutely blanking on. But in this fight, I'm looking forward to this one simply because, again, it's sink or swim. You lose this fight, you're in an awful spot in the UFC's heavyweight division. I do like the camp change at one point for Don'Tale Mayes. I think you're just going to pick up on all of those things. It's going to be diffusion through osmosis here, and I really do like Don'Tale Mayes in this spot. For me, it's a bit more of that pop and popcorn fight that we kind of debuted last weekend with question mark kicks. But overall, I have Don'Tale Mayes in this one.
So the underdog is pretty tempting in this fight to go with Roque Martinez, but I do see the technical boxing and just really the overall game plan that Don'Tale Mayes should be able to put together to fight a guy like Martinez with the great camp that he comes from, with, the striking of Brandon Gibson and just the phenomenal boxing that he already possesses. We've seen Roque Martinez, even in that Mirko Cro Cop fight. Now, Cro Cop is an absurdly high-level striker, but we're not seeing prime Cro Cop by any means in that fight. fight, he was able to get to Martinez. It's not like Martinez is an unhittable guy. So any guy at heavyweight who has good power has a chance to beat Martinez. So add the power along with the technique of Mays. I think it's a Mays win all the way.
Matt, really looking forward to this fight. We both have Don'Tale Mays. You're going to want to keep it locked in as we have a very exciting card. A lot of under-the-radar fights. Comment below and let us know who you think's going to win this one. Make sure you check out Question Mark Kicks at the end of the week. And Matt, as we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Low-key banger at 135 pounds as we have Geraldo de Freitas taking on Tony Gravely. And I mean, Matt, these guys, former champions from different organizations. For Geraldo de Freitas, coming out of Chuto, Brazil, he was their bantamweight champ. For Tony Gravely, he was a champ with CES, King of the Cage, Fight Lab, and PACF before joining the UFC. And it's insane because the guy's only 29 years old and he got into MMA recently, relatively recently, I should say. October 10th, 2015 was Tony Gravely's first fight. So in a span of about 5 years, this guy has 25 fights. He fought 8 times in 1 year. It's absolutely insane, the resume that he's put together too, because we're not just talking about small names. We're talking about well-known household names, even on the regional scene. I mean, fights against Bellator's former bantamweight elite, Ricky Bandejas. That's just one of those. And we'll get into more of them. For Geraldo de Freitas, coming into the UFC, a great win over Felipe Colares. And then in his last time out, didn't go his way, lost a split decision to Chris Gutierrez. If you go over on MMA Decisions, a lot of those fellow media members had scored that fight for Geraldo de Freitas. A small number scoring it for Gutierrez, but just on that night, you know how the judges are. Sometimes it doesn't work in your favor. I'm really looking forward to this one because from Geraldo de Freitas, you have that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, you have that pedigree coming out of a great gym in Novo União, and we've seen the improvements in his striking as he's continued on in MMA. For Tony Gravely, black belt in Taekwondo. Hey, Anthony Pettis got to the top of the heap with a black belt in Taekwondo. No matter what Matt thinks about Taekwondo, we're revealed to behind the curtain there. But in terms of this fight, Matt, Tony Gravely has really good wrestling and really, really good forward pressure. And he's one of the smaller guys that you're going to find in this division, but once he steps into the cage, it's not so much so.
Tony Gravely is just compact, and he reminds me a lot of kind of Josh Emmett at 145. Not to say they have the exact same style, but Josh Emmett, what's he really good at? Well, he's a phenomenal wrestler. He's got really big power when he moves forward. Exactly what Tony Gravely does. Geraldo de Freitas, if we do want to have kind of a UFC comparison, NBA draft coming up, a lot of draft night comparisons, Geraldo de Freitas reminds me a little bit of kind of an earlier Charles Oliveira, where he invested very heavily in jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai, and he doesn't really concern himself much with the wrestling defense because de Freitas knows he's not going to exert a lot of his energy trying to take Tony Gravely down or really any of his opponents. Wrestling's not his strong suit. So he just really thinks, well, if I'm going to the ground, I might as well let my opponent take me down, and then worst case, I can try to get a sleep, work some submissions off my back. This is an interesting fight too, just because they do contrast against each other. The wrestling of Gravely along with the jiu-jitsu of de Freitas off of his back, I think will make for a really interesting fight. I think we could see a lot of scrambles in this fight. Tony Gravely's in a really weird camp, though, and we're going to call this the Sarah McMahon camp, where when he's on top, he's got phenomenal ground and pound, just crazy explosive, has some good chokes and submissions of his own, but he is more of kind of a control and ground and pound type fighter. When he's on bottom, though, it just all goes out the window. He doesn't really get up to his feet all that well. He will try to chain wrestle his way to get back on top. We saw that with Glover Teixeira and Thiago Santos over the weekend in the third round, where Thiago Santos is on top of Glover, landing really good ground and pound, but Glover was able to kind of stay conscious enough and really stay involved enough in the fight to then try to wrestle his way on top. Gravely will do a similar style, but he can tire himself out going for some of those bigger techniques. And it's something that worries me as he fights kind of the upper echelon guys in the UFC, is that if he is going for these big takedowns every time, it's not just a double leg, it's a big slam. Every action are these big actions where if he isn't getting the stoppage from them and the fight is starting to go on, and into those, late second round, third round, and as he moves up the rankings, if he gets into 5-round fights, fourth and fifth, that is going to start to be an issue. The good news, though, I do think just the wrestling and the pure athleticism of Tony Gravely is going to be good enough to get him at least up until that maybe top 30 range, and then he's going to start to run into some problems. But I do like his style, and I do think it's a very buildable style on into the future. He knows what he does well, and he sticks to that. But de Freitas kind of has all the tools that can give a guy like Gravely a lot of problems.
And I mean, that's the thing. You look at Tony Gravely's record, and again, I mentioned some of those names, but Pat Sabatini, the first loss. I mean, hey, Pat Sabatini's actually had a pretty good career if you want to follow up on that one. Ricky Bandejas, the next loss. Then he loses to Merab Dvalishvili. Then he loses to Manny Bermudez. The other one, Patchy Mix. And then Brett Johns in his last time out. Brett Johns, Patchy Mix, Rabdashvili, and Manny Bermudez, I'll say. Good jiu-jitsu, really, really tough guys to fight. I mean, Manny Bermudez, he would still be in the UFC if it wasn't for the weight issues, really.
I don't know about that.
But that was the major kicker, and the fact that he lost 2 in a row, but still, the weight was an issue. And then the fight against Bandejas is kind of a weird one. He got submitted by a striker who's no longer with Bellator, whose ground game wasn't overly great, and he got submitted by Pat Sabatini. That's one of those things. I really like Tony Gravely's game for sure. He's a very well-balanced type of fighter. But again, when he really needs to get to it, and you see a lot of fighters, they get rocked like Glover Teixeira. They get rocked. They're going to take that fight right down to the ground and do exactly what they need to do with the ground and pound and the top pressure. That's what you're going to see out of Tony Gravely. With Geraldo de Freitas, though, you look at it, and maybe the record, it doesn't just jump off of the page. They might not be a lot of names that you might recognize here in North America. And again, we talk about the Shooto title. That's great. I look at the losses. It is what it is. Split decision loss, another decision loss, and then the Gutierrez fight, a split decision loss. He definitely has that jiu-jitsu. He also has decent combinations on the feet. I like his leg kicks, and he's one of those fighters, and we talk about them. He has the combinations, but he has that whip on the end of his shots that I really do like to see. So if we have a look at the odds for this fight, Matt, might be a little bit of a surprise. It's a bit of a surprise to me. Tony Gravely opened a -160. That line dropped to a -200 very quickly. He's now evened out at a -191. If we look at Geraldo de Freitas, opened up a +140. He's now at a +159. And if we have a look at the total votes, again, it's not so much overwhelmingly. Oh, wait, yeah, it is. Out of 374 total votes, Tony Gravely commanding 83% of those, and 70% of fans picking him to win the fight by decision. So it seems like the odds makers and the bettors have Tony Gravely to get the win. It seems like the fans have Tony Gravely to get the win. Matt, what do you think on this fight?
I also have Tony Gravely to get the win, and here's the X factor I didn't bring up all video. Geraldo de Freitas does one thing that I really do think is going to get him bit in this fight. He drops his hands terribly every single time that anyone does a takedown attempt to him. It leaves his chin very high, Luke Rockhold style. I think if Tony Gravely can at least feint the takedown, he doesn't have to be going for the takedown constantly. His stand-up is more than good enough to stand on the feet with a guy like de Freitas. But if he is threatening the takedown, making de Freitas drop his hands, I do think a big overhand is going to be waiting for him eventually as the fight moves on. I think Tony Gravely will be good enough to not get submitted. That's my biggest fear in this fight. And he will be able to start landing big power shots as the fight continues. I think he's got the cardio advantage, the wrestling advantage, and the power advantage, so it's hard not to pick him.
And I mean, that's the thing. You really have to think. Methods of victory for both these guys. Geraldo de Freitas actually very well rounded. That's the other thing. I mean, we look at the stats. You can't put too much stock into them. I'll show them throughout this video. And I show this for a lot of the fighters that have 3 or more UFC fights. For de Freitas, only has the 2. For Tony Gravely, only has 2 that you can see because the Ray Rodriguez fight on Contender Series counts towards UFC stats. So you got to take these all with a grain of salt. But the takedown defense at 60%. The takedown accuracy at 50%. Geraldo de Freitas fishing for takedowns. He got them against Gutierrez, and he definitely got them against Felipe Clares in his UFC debut. I like the positive striking differential. The other thing, for Tony Gravely, very accurate striker, but again, a lot of that's going to take place on the mat. So for me, this fight is a very difficult one to try and pick, but I do like the underdog in this one, Matt. I like Geraldo de Freitas. I think he has more than a good opportunity in this one. Again, I like the volume, and I like the fact that he's not totally lost on the mat. He's not one of those guys that's going to get caught on his back. He's going to try and get out of some of those bad positions. And Tony Gravely struggled against some really high-level jiu-jitsu practitioners in MMA. Will Geraldo de Freitas be that guy? I mean, that's for the fans to decide, and it's ultimately for these two guys to decide. But we'll see. I like Geraldo de Freitas. You've got Tony Gravely.
Okay, so I think the odds are ridiculous. I do think this is a pick'em fight, but I do like Gravely in this one.
Matt's got Gravely. I've got Geraldo de Freitas. I'm really looking forward to this card, Matt. We've got a great main event. Islam Makhachev taking on Rafael dos Anjos in the main event. You're going to want to stick around for that, Matt. As we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. We have a big fight at women's strawweight, and finally, we keep seeing more and more talent coming through that Invicta pipeline. And Kanako Murata coming in, the former Invicta strawweight champ. She just picked up the biggest win of her career over Emily Ducati out there. A split decision win, but she became that strawweight queen. Now going to apply her talents against Quiet Storm, Canada's Randa Marcos, coming out of Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And listen, Matt, Randa Marcos broke a terrible trend in her last time out. It was just win one, lose one, pepper in a couple of draws. Well, she ended up losing to Amanda Hebos and then Mackenzie Dern in her last time out. Got submitted very quickly in that one. Now, for Kanako Murata, you look at the record, 11-1. The only loss is to Rin Nakai, and if you want to see the wildest career, look at Rin Nakai. Her 2 UFC fights, she gets the call up at 16-0 and gets Miesha Tate, and then Leslie Smith loses those two.
It's gonna happen.
And see you later. But for Kanako Murata, I look at that overall body of work, very, very decent level of talent coming up through. And then that Invicta run after competing with Ryzen. Liana Pirozin, she gets a rear naked choke win there, and then just continued to really threaten in her fight against Emily Ducati. For Randa Marcos, we know what it is. It's that frustrating style with her hands out, that striking that you get. And it's Randa Marcos' wrestling and the defensive submissions off her back that really kind of threaten against just about all level of talent. And if you really want to be hard on Randa Marcos, I know the UFC website is going to show that maybe she's 10-10 with the one draw. Listen, that one extra loss was on The Ultimate Fighter. It was a 3-rounder. It's considered an exhibition bout. I just gave her benefit of the doubt and put 10-9-1 on that graphic. But for Randa Marcos, the level of competition's always been there.
100%.
She's beaten a former UFC champ in Claudia Esparza. She's fought former title challengers former titleists. She's got a fight against Rose Namajunas. Didn't win that one. She lost to Karolina Kovalkiewicz. She's fought the Juliana Limas, the Nina Ansaroff. She beat Angela Hill. I can go on and on about this fight map, but stylistically, these fighters are actually quite similar. We have a national wrestling champion in Kanako Murata making her debut. You have Randa Marcos. It's just pretty well a picture of consistency. What do you make of this one? Because I think it's a fun fight.
So I think every woman who joins the strawweight division has to fight Randa Marcos at some point. And I don't even think it's just my rule. I think the UFC might have a rule for it too, because it seems like every time there's really anyone with some hype behind them in the strawweight division, the UFC goes, perfect. We're going to throw them on the Fight Pass prelims against Randa Marcos. And it is unfortunate that that's kind of where she finds herself. And when you look at her record too, it is salty. But the level of competition definitely is there. And I would rather someone losing to high-level competition than just continuously beating a bunch of people who they know that they can beat. Because you never get any better if you just... Like, if I played Craig in basketball forever, I would never get any better. If Craig played me in hockey, he'd never get any better. Because there's just that big of a difference between those two sports. With Randa and her wrestling style, I do think Murata is going to be a really hard opponent to get to the mat. And I think this whole fight can be simplified as to who is the better wrestler out of these two. You know what you're going to get with Randa Marcos. She got phenomenal top pressure. She has good submissions. We don't see enough of her submission game, I don't believe at least, because I would argue the best woman who she's fought recently would have been Angela Hill, and she beat her without much trouble. Like, she took her down immediately, got into full mount, had some really good positions, some really good grappling showed off in that fight. And for Marcos too, we've kind of seen an inconsistency in her grappling, which doesn't really exist for most other MMA fighters. Like, when you think of Damian Maia, it's not like in some fights his jiu-jitsu is just kind of off. With Randa Marcos, sometimes she goes out there and she's really wrestling dominant. She's going to go out, and if she can't get that first takedown attempt, she'll shoot 4, 5, 6 times until she can get the takedown. But then in other fights, she's a little bit more passive and lets the fight come to her. That cannot be the version of Randa Marcos who comes to this fight, because for Kanako Murata, if she is the one pushing the pressure, getting Randa Marcos on the back foot and forcing Marcos to be defensive the whole fight, not only will it not look good for the judges, that's just the worst position for Marcos. She's not great moving backwards, and I do think we saw that in the Claudia Gadelha fight. Awful fight. You don't need to rewatch it. We've done the research, so you don't have to. But Randa Marcos basically just stands there and doesn't do a lot. And I know Claudia was probably conscious of the fact that Randa is one of those cardio machines, and Claudia herself, that'd be one of the bigger weaknesses of her game. So I'm sure she just didn't want to overexert herself to let Marcos come in those last couple of rounds. But we do see such a stark contrast between the two different versions of Randa Marcos that her at her best, she's not going to beat a Joanna Jędrzejczyk or a Rose Namajunas. Like, I'm not spoiling anything, but her at her best can beat those, 5 to 10 range fighters, and there's nothing wrong with that. So for Kanako Murata, if her wrestling is really up to that level, and if she can go out there and put on a dominant grappling performance against a fighter like Randa Marcos, I really do think the sky's the limit. If she goes out there and outstrikes her, people can outstrike Randa Marcos, but for you to be a grappler and going out there, and if you can out-grapple her, it's going to show us a lot more about your game and really tell us where your ceiling is.
And I look at this fight, and we had another debuting fighter that was a national wrestling champ just a couple of weeks ago in Lilia Storyarenko when she took on Lauren Murphy. Way too big of a step up in competition. Yeah. This is the perfect type of fight for Kanako Murata because, again, You get to know what you're going to get, and then maybe in her next fight, you match her up against a striker. So ultimately, this is a really fun one. If we have a look at the odds, Matt, Kanako Murata opened up the favorite, and she's continued to climb as such. She opened a minus 130. She's now down to a minus 169 over on Best Fight Odds. If we look at Randa Marcos, open plus 108. She's now at a plus 142. If we have a look at the Tapology votes, limited sample size, but out of 272 total votes, 78% going Murata, and they're mostly all 74% picking her to win by decision. I think that is probably the most simple path to victory, and I think that that's probably what we're going to get out of a lot of people who've watched tape on this fight. But do you disagree with the masses on this one?
I don't know if Randa Marcos just sits at home and just religiously studies the judging criteria for MMA fights, but I've never seen a person eke out more grappling-heavy split decision wins in my whole life. And she's been on the wrong side of those, too. It kind of works both ways, because when you're always involved in these kind of, I don't want to say low volume, because sometimes they're not, but when you're always involved in a lot of these stalemate matchups where it seems like every time Randa Marcos lands a combination, her opponent's also landing at the same time. Or when she gets a takedown, well then her opponent gets up and takes her down for a minute. There's always kind of this ebb and flow to her fights, but she does know how to win rounds at the UFC level. And for nothing else, I do think that's a valuable experience level. And I'm going to pick the underdog in Randa Marcos. I think she's been in this position so many times before where it's this young upstart who's coming over from outside the UFC. She's not supposed to win this fight. It's not like an Amanda Hebos fight, though, where I'm like, okay, there's no way Randa Marcos can win this. Of course she didn't. It's a fight where, okay, stylistically, her opponent does a lot of the same things she does. We've seen that before in a woman named Carla Esparza, who was the UFC champ at one point. So I do think Randa Marcos is going to be able to, quite frankly, Randa Marcos her way to a win. Do just enough in the grappling area, land her good ground and pound, keep the fight in just frustrating scenarios for Kanako Murata, and she should be able to get the win.
I like this fight for Kanako Murata, and here's why. It's the fact that getting ready for a fight like this, and if you're training with such high-level talent like Kana Morimoto, who's a K1 champ at flyweight, that's definitely a great person to train with coming out of Silver Wolf Gym. But I mean, you look at Randa Marcos, and the one question mark that I really have, we saw her against Mackenzie Dern in a fight that was into the pandemic. And Randa Marcos, if you followed her career whatsoever, she's from the Windsor area. If you understand geography, it's a bit of a head scratcher of a spot because it's a part of Canada, obviously, but it's lower than Detroit. So the thing with Randa Marcos, she trains a bit in Windsor, and then she has a camp that's over in Michigan. Well, now with the way that the world is, it's a little difficult to go between Canada and the States. And for Randa Marcos, listen, straight up, it's going to be hard to fight Mackenzie Dern. I know she was a big underdog in that fight, and it wasn't much of a surprise that Mackenzie Dern won that one. But for Marcos, it's tough because you can't get all of the rounds in the States. You can't get all the rounds in Canada. So for me, it's not necessarily an inconsistency out of Randa Marcos because really it's a career of inconsistency. You look at the record, it is. But I like Kanako Murata in this one. I like that national wrestling pedigree. And as long as it's not a Lilia Stoliarenko type of performance, I do like Japan's Kanako Murata in this one, Matt. We continue to disagree on some of these fights.
I can't disagree with any of the points you made about this fight, though.
That's
That's the problem. Like, I think Randa Marcos is going to win.
Okay.
There you go. I can't disagree with anything you said about Kanako Murata, though, and that's what makes this fight so fun.
And I think it's going to be a great one. So we disagree on the picks. I've got Murata. You've got Randa Marcos. But hey, overall, this is one of those ones I'm just going to tip my cap, enjoy it for what it is, and I'm really looking forward to it. And there's a lot of fights on this card that, hey, just a lot of pure enjoyment. So make sure you check out the rest of the playlist. We've got a great lineup, and it's headed by Islam Makhachev taking on Rafael dos Anjos. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it. I picked this as my potential fight of the night. We have Jose Alberto Quinones El Teco taking on The Last Samurai, Luis Smolka. Matt, Luis Smolka was one of those guys, and he was just like that song by the Counting Crows, I'm just hanging around. That's all I know of the song. But he was just kind of hanging around.
Pucker in my butt before the fight.
Yeah, look that one up. That's a Luis Smolka direct quote. He likes those fights that pucker up his butthole. But when I look at this one, Luis Smolka was just kind of hanging around at 125. He was having issues with the weight cut. He was just kind of winning some, losing some, but he was always facing decent levels of competition. And for Jose Alberto Quinones, I look at his UFC run, and it's somewhat puzzling because the names that he's fought, Alejandro Perez, Nathaniel Wood, Sean O'Malley, I mean, those are some halfway decent names. Look at Alejandro Perez. I'd like to see him fight a little bit more. I look at this fight as a weird one because for Jose Quinones, and the reason why I think this could be a possible fight of the night, He's an all-action type of guy. And for Luis Smolka, we talk about his takedown defense and his takedown accuracy. It's quite poor in the UFC. We're hitting about a third of them, and we're defending about a third of them. But overall, his jiu-jitsu is slippery, and he's coming out of one of the better, more underrated camps that we don't hear enough of in Team Oyama. I know when Joe Rogan's on the call, it's one of those ones that he's definitely going to point out. But apart from that, you don't have a lot of fighters coming from that gym that you really get hammered down week in, week out. So in this fight, it's a very interesting one. And again, that level of competition for Luis Smolka that we talk about, let's go back and have a look at some of those fights, Matt. Because he went on a 3-fight losing streak that saw him out of the UFC. 4-fight losing streak. Brandon Moreno, the assassin baby. Ray Borg, future title challenger. Tim Elliott, former title challenger.
Also fight of the night.
And Mateus Nicolau. Man, straight up, where's Mateus Nicolau at these days?
I think.
But apart from that, Luis Smolka, you lose 4 in a row, see you later. He wins 2 on the regional scene. And I know that there were various reasons as to why. You know, the mental side wasn't there. He was having issues outside of the cage. He figured everything out, picked up 2 big wins, 3 big wins rather, and one of those over Kyle Estrada. And if you know me, you know that for me, Kyle Estrada is that benchmark win that you have to make it into the UFC. Poor Kyle Estrada has faced this level of competition and the losses. Loses to Luis Smolka, Smolka makes it back into the UFC. Loses to Adrian Yanez, Yanez makes it into the UFC. Loses to Kevin Natividad, Natividad makes it into the UFC. Just shouts. Poor Kyle Estrada. But Matt, I think this is a possible fight of the night. I gotta let you take over. Are you on that same wavelength? Are you as excited as I am for this one?
Yes and no. Now, if you followed the Fight Night Nation for as long as hopefully you have, we have theories and different dumb things that we talk about with every fighter, and I have to talk about Luis Smolka and the Luis Smolka effect. We haven't trademarked the term yet, but we probably should. Luis Smolka, phenomenal at jiu-jitsu, but he's a guy who is willing to give away rounds in search of the perfect submission. And it does remind me a little bit of Tyron Woodley's striking style as his career's developed. And weird 2 people to bring up, but hear me out. Tyron Woodley, as he's gotten older, has figured out, okay, I don't need to throw 500 punches a fight. If I wait and wait and wait, kind of like Uriah Hall, and just find that perfect opening, I can end it in 1. And that is really good when you are, a crazy high-level fighter like them. Not to say that Luis Smolka is not a high-level fighter, but just levels. This guy's titles and main events. Luis Smolka off his back, he'll fish for the submission. He'll be trying to get different sweeps and whatnot. But if he doesn't get them, he's more than happy to just remain on his back. And Brian Ortega was a guy who did this. A lot of people remember the first, portion of Brian Ortega's career. He was really just getting 3rd-round stoppages. And if you go back and watch a lot of those fights, he's more than happy to just let guys be in his guard because he knows I can finish them whenever I want to. I'm okay if Brian Ortega does that. Brian Ortega can do whatever he wants on a jiu-jitsu mat because Brian Ortega is basically an adopted Gracie at this point. If you watch his fights, he can submit anyone. Luis Smolka can get the submission, but he's a guy who's been submitted himself. And Luis Smolka, the reason that I just feel like my MMA fandom is so tied to him is the first time I ever saw Brandon Moreno fight, he fought Luis Smolka. It was on short notice, and he was able to guillotine Smolka. And I had held Smolka in such high regard at the time that made me one of the bigger Brandon Moreno fans ever. And Smolka, another guy too, he main evented a show before anyone really cared about the 125ers. A lot of people forget this. He had main evented against Paddy Holohan in Ireland. That was supposed to be like a big Paddy Holohan welcome show. And Luis Smolka had other ideas. So Smolka in the top position is by far my favorite place for him to be in. He does have really underrated ground and pound because when I do think of Luis Smolka, and I do think the story around his career is the submissions are very much tied to his career, but his striking has gotten better, and especially in this kind of second version of him that we've seen in the UFC. Yes, Casey Kenny beat him quite badly, but Casey Kenny, everyone knows how good he is now. The Matt Schnell fight, Craig's a lot hotter on Matt Schnell than I am, but still, losing to a guy like that, there's no shame in it whatsoever. And we have seen those, I will say, at least minor improvements in Smolka's game, because the first go-around in the UFC, it was just wrestling and scramble-based. Now he will kind of work in his combinations to get the takedown, and I do really like that about him.
And I mean, you saw that first fight back against Sue Mutterji, that was a huge win, gets the submission, but again, you saw the improvements in his striking. The fight against Ryan McDonald, a complete performance. Matt Schnell's a tricky one, and again, at that one, he weighed in at 135. It was a fight at 35, but Matt Schnell, he's a flyweight. So that was kind of a bit of a weird one. But I look at this one, and if you look at the stats for Jose Quinones, this is where it gets squirrely. So we started incorporating the stats into the show, but you have to take those with a grain of salt. You really do, because it doesn't paint a full picture. Jose Quinones, good takedown average per 15 minutes, good takedown accuracy, 50% takedown defense, not terrible, especially against some really tough fighters. And that's the thing. I mean, you look at Jose Quinones and the losses, especially so far in the UFC, Nathaniel Wood, the forever prospect, and Sean O'Malley. And O'Malley had a great performance. I mean, Jose Quinones wasn't able to do anything at all in that fight. So take that for what it's worth. He got hit 18 times, and he got finished. And in the fight against Nathaniel Wood, it was back and forth, and he got submitted. In the fight against Alejandro Perez, he lost the decision. I look at the wins that Jose Quinones has, and I scratch my head because he beat Leonardo Morales, no longer in the UFC. Beat Joey Gomez, no longer in the UFC. Beat Diego Ribas, no longer in the UFC. Beat Teruto Ishihara, no longer in the UFC. He beat Carlos Joaquin, who has a fight coming up with Future FFC. Every single guy Jose Quinones has beat is no longer in the UFC. And the really troubling thing is he beat Carlos Joaquin back in 2019, who's no longer in the UFC. Jose Quinones has beaten guys that aren't of that ilk. And the guys that he's lost to, even Alejandro Perez, are halfway good. So for me, Jose Quinones, the wins don't tell me anything.
If he beats Louis Smolka, does that statement still ring true? Because Louis Smolka was cut from the UFC at one point.
No, I don't think so. Louis Smolka is a halfway decent opponent.
You bring up all the takedown attempts and really just the wrestling of Jose Quinones. I don't think we're going to see any of it in this fight. I think Jose Quinones is going to be more than happy to just strike on the outside. And as I see Craig nodding his head in my peripheral, I do think Jose Quinones is a much better striker than he gets credit for. And a lot of that has to do with the Sean O'Malley performance. And we can sit here till the cows come home and talk about Sean O'Malley and his career trajectory and where you think his ceiling is. But one thing he's amazing at is striking. And if you do try to get into a pure kickboxing or a kickboxing version of an MMA fight with him, you're probably going to end up on the losing end. I wouldn't take a whole lot from that fight and apply it to this one just because Louis Smolka, a very different type of opponent. I want to pick Louis Smolka in this fight. I really do. I like his career trajectory. I love the story of him coming back to the UFC after he's kind of conquered his demons, kind of outside the cage. I don't know how he wins this fight. I don't know if he is going to be able to close the range on Quinones and get the takedown. Because if the fight is on the feet, I do like the improvements that Smolka's made in his striking throughout his career. I still don't think he's on that sort of... I would still have him as a below average striker, and especially at range too. He does carry his hands low, and when he throws punches, I mentioned this in the Marcos video, whenever Louis Smolka lands like a 3-punch combination, it always seems like he's eating at least 2 punches for those 3. Not a great ratio. I know he's landing at a little bit higher of a rate, but it's always great when a fighter can be, and I know we're always comparing them up to these high level guys, but a guy like Robert Whittaker, who when he goes in, it's I'm going to land my 3 punches, my kick, and then I'm out of range, and you don't got to worry about it. Louis Smolka is there to be hit. I do like the power of Quinones. We haven't seen a lot of it in the UFC, but he throws really good straight shots. He's great at catching people on the end of his punches, too. Again, Amanda Nunes, a good example of that. Quinones, he does have sort of that longer whip on his shots, something that I really like. So I do think Quinones, the power punching will be able to get to Smolka as the fight progresses. And I do think it will start to accumulate more and more as the fight goes on. And the fight will just keep on shifting further towards Quinones.
And Matt, if we have a look at the odds for this one, I mean, are you at all surprised where we're coming in? I mean, we have Louis Smolka, a slight favorite, open to -135. The line dropped to about a -175. And now it's come up a bit to the point where Louis Smolka, at an average on best fight odds, -141. For Jose Quinones, opens a +115, goes up as high as about a +145. He's now evened out, again, +116. And over on Tapology, to kind of add that in and round it out, at a 423 total votes, 82% going Smolka, 57% saying he's going to get the win by decision. That doesn't really line up with what you were thinking, but overall, if you're making a pick on this one, what do you think here?
Jose Quinones. I think the takedown defense will be good enough. And again, we see a lot of his wrestling offense. We don't see a lot of his wrestling defense because he fights in that sort of Max Griffin style where it's, I'm going to strike, but if I get in trouble or if I'm even a little bit uncomfortable, I'm not afraid to shoot for the takedown. He is more than comfortable on the ground. I don't think it's going to be one of those cases where, okay, well, for as long as the fight's on the feet, Quinones is going to be in control, and as long as the fight's on the floor, Smolka is. I do think it's a much more competitive fight in both aspects. I do think Smolka will kind of get some shots in. He will go for the takedown. It'll be a fun fight for as long as it lasts, but I'm going to pick Quinones.
I think as long as the weight cut isn't an issue for Louis Smolka, and not that it has really been at 35, but as long as it's not really an issue, again, I do like his jiu-jitsu, I do like his striking improvements, and again, can he land more volume than Jose Quinones? I mean, if we go by the stats, we're close. I mean, you've got more out of Louis Smolka, but he's accepting more damage. The defense numbers are up for Quinones at a tune of 66% striking defense to 52% for Luis Smolka. Striking accuracy being the same. The differential a little bit more in the favor of Luis Smolka. So if he's able to really string together some volume, if Jose Quinones starts to get a little bit frustrated and we start working some of the takedowns, again, you have to worry about the jiu-jitsu of Luis Smolka. I don't think this is one of those fights where we have to necessarily worry about Luis Smolka. Oh, geez, he's fighting Casey Kenny. Watch out for that front choke, or watch out for those things that we typically see in a Luis Smolka fight. Now, we have adopted a term on this guy, so that's a little bit difficult to say. But I do like Luis Smolka in this fight, especially as a small favorite.
I mean, I see where you're coming from, but again, Luis Smolka, we have a term to describe his grappling. And now you're saying you like his grappling. I don't see him getting the submission. I do think Quinones, fight IQ-wise, is probably a little bit better than Smolka too. And I do like that Quinones, when he is all the way on the outside, he likes to stay busy. He will throw the jab out there. He will throw the light kick, whereas Smolka, when he is striking, sometimes he finds himself in these weird kind of periods of inactivity. With Quinones, if he's been able to defend a few takedowns, if fatigue does start to become an issue for both guys, I do just favor Quinones as the fight progresses, because his striking is going to stay the same. He doesn't need a crazy output. He doesn't need a lot of power to really get the results he's looking for. He's going to be looping combinations together, and if he does get the results in the combos, maybe Luis Smolka goes down, but I am going to pick Quinones by decision. I don't know if I fully agree with you on the fight of the night potential of this one, but I do think it'll be a fun one nonetheless.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to this. I've got Luis Smolka, you've got Jose Alberto Quinones, and Matt, as the week goes on, maybe things change. Maybe we watch a little bit more fight tape. Maybe something comes out of this one that we're not overly sure of as it stands this Sunday night. So you got to make sure that you check out Fight Night Picks, Kicks later on in the week, where we get an opportunity to preview the fights. We get to chat with you in the live chat.
It's a good time.
And it is a pretty darn good time. So make sure you check out Kicks on Saturday. And who knows, things could change and we could change some of our picks. So I'm really looking forward to that. You got to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it. Hey, this is a Matt Allen fight of the night. We got the great white Alex Morono. And hey, fight week is now. Shark Week was a while ago, but we get a great white sighting in Las Vegas. And I mean, hey, he's taking on Skeletor Rhys McKee. And listen, I know a lot of people are going to drop down in the comments. You're going to be all over Rhys McKee, how his debut went. Let me get this out of the way now. It went bad. It went historically bad. And Khamzat Chimaev built his name off of poor old Rhys McKee coming in on short notice. There was that weird exchange on social media where Graham Boylan, who runs Cage Warriors but is also Rhys McKee's manager, goes on and then films the fact that he's like, hey, I got you a fight. It's Khamzat Chimaev. You're in the UFC. Bye. And that's kind of how it happened in a nutshell. But Rhys McKee, I mean, his record at 10-3 is very, very good. He's a two-time Bama lightweight champ. He recently competed with Cage Warriors as well. And there's a lot of things to like. I mean, out of all of his wins, they're all finished wins. He has plenty of submissions. Coming into the UFC, had wins over Jefferson George, Perry Goodwin, and Hakan Foss on that 3-fight win streak. And I look at the losses, and they're names that you recognize. Tim Barnett, Terry Brazier from the regional scene. Terry Brazier now with Bellator, former 2-division Bama champ, and again, Chimaev. So Rhys McKee, his bread and butter being the jiu-jitsu, training out of a really good gym, Next Generation Northern Ireland with Norman Park. I mean, KSW fans, they love Norman Park. Mateus Gamrot doesn't love Norman Park. But in this one, Alex Morono, I have it listed in the graphic there, training out of Gracie Baja Woodlands. We've seen him kind of cross-train at some different gyms in Texas. Fortis MMA being one of them. He trained there to get ready for his fight against Max Griffin. Holy smokes. What a fight against Max Griffin. Wow. I mean, back and forth. First round, second round, Morono rocks him. Third round, Max Griffin comes back. Alex Morono is one of those guys that I was never sold on him. I'll be honest. From personal opinion, I was like, hey, it's an Alex Morono
I can go
fight.
buy gas from a guy right now who looks just like him.
It's like, hey, he beat Zach Otto, he beat Song Kanan, he loses to Jordan Meehan. All right, it is what it is. But in those 3 fights, I really got a good level of, all right, Max Griffin, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He has that in his back pocket. We see it. He has good wrestling. He's a Taekwondo black belt. Everything's kind of started to come together a little bit more for Alex Morono. Now, you could counter that and say, well, he got knocked out by Chaos Williams, who's now in this weekend's co-main event.
It's gonna happen.
You wouldn't be wrong. That much is true. But with Alex Morono, I do like the level of competition that he's fought on the regional scene, coming into the UFC, wins over Derek Krantz, then he beats Kyle Noak, then he beats a guy that Matt's really high on.
I was.
And James Moon Tasseri. And I look at the fights that he's had. He's lost some fights that he probably shouldn't have lost. Kaito Nakamura, Jordan Meehan, no longer in the UFC. But I do like Alex Morono in the fact that he is a fun fighter to watch. That much is true.
He 100% is, and Alex Morono's style does remind me a lot of Jordan Meehan, because Alex Morono, what is he good at? Kind of everything. He doesn't do anything crazy. He's not going to go out there and throw a bunch of wheel kicks. No, he's going to go out there. He's good at wrestling. He's good at jiu-jitsu. He's good at striking. Now, I'd say the first half of his UFC career, we saw a lot more of the grappling side of Alex Morono, who was going out there much more takedown heavy, and you could tell that there was just sort of a lack of confidence in his own striking. But I would say ever since after that Jordan Meehan fight, starting the Kenan Song fight, going into the Zach Otto Max Griffin, he just seems like he has a much higher level of comfort, at least with his own striking. Because when you see him really let his hands go, really let his combinations go, you're like, wow, Alex Morono, like he's got legit kickboxing. But you look at some of his fights, and the volume's not really there, and he doesn't really hit with the not the force you think he's able to, but you see him land these big shots and you're like, wow, his opponent's not really moving by them. But again, it feels like Alex Morono's at least comfortable enough with himself in the UFC, and it took a little while for that to happen. That could be octagon jitters, that could just be level of competition, but I do think that 3-fight win streak can be put up against anything Rhys McKee's done, and it really is comparable. Say what you want about Max Griffin, he almost severed a guy's ear last night, so that puts you in pretty high standing in my book. I do like the side of Alex Morono. It got him caught in his last fight against Chaos Williams because he is a guy who will go out there and he is more likely to strike than he used to be. This matchup is phenomenal, though, and it really does tell you how high the UFC must be on a guy like Rhys McKee, because, yes, they fed him to Khamzat in his first fight. That's about the meanest thing you could do to a person. Hey, you have to fight Chimaev on a week's notice. But they're giving him Alex Morono, who's not a scrub by any means, who I would say is on that cusp of, like, the top 25 in the welterweight division. He's not, like, one win away from being ranked, but I would say he's much more competitive than just your standard, 2-3 fight UFC welterweight. Rhys McKee cannot get taken down in this fight. I know he's got a phenomenal ground game, but the biggest weakness of his career, and really as a guy who stands about 6'1" and weighs less than Rhys McKee, tall and thin, easy to get taken down. And we saw that in the Chimaev fight. But that's not going to be the story of this fight. I really do hope people can kind of kick the stigma of that performance away from Rhys McKee, because listen, Chimaev's 3 fights in the UFC, and he's fighting the second-ranked welterweight in his next fight. He's one of those anomaly talents that we don't see very often. If Rhys McKee was matched up against really any other welterweight in his UFC debut, we would have seen a lot more from him, and I'm sure people would be a lot higher on him, but I think stylistically this is a really fun matchup because we are going to get a much more striking-oriented fight out of both these guys because they're both willing to play that game.
There's one fight on Alex Morono's record that reminds me a little bit of a Rhys McKee. There's one fight on Rhys McKee's fight that reminds me of an Alex Morono fight. For McKee, it's the fight that he had against Perry Goodwin. And if you've ever watched Cage Warriors, Perry Goodwin's one of my guys. Like, it's weird, but you have to watch a Perry Goodwin fight. And I know his record isn't great if you just look at that number on the paper, but he's fought a really good level of competition. I mean, he knocked out Alexander Jakobsen with the crazy hooks that he has, and that's the thing. He's willing to strike. He's willing to push a pace. He stands heavy on his lead leg, and he's there to Julian Lane a fight. He just wants to bang. And I look at Rhys McKee, and he withstood that. He was able to get a nice win in that fight, and really fought his fight. 3rd-round guillotine choke. He beat Hackenfoss. That's a big win, too. I mean, Hackenfoss wasn't going to wow you off the page at 9-7, but he took on a decent level of competition on the European scene. For Alex Morono, and this one's a little bit of a non-comparable, but it's a fight against Josh Berkman. And I know it's sandwiched between losses to Jordan Meehan, frustrating fighter. Kaito Nakamura, very frustrating fighter.
Josh Berkman, 73 years old. But
that's where I was going with it. Kaito Nakamura, very diverse skill set. For Josh Berkman, long in the tooth. Very, very long in the tooth.
Like
even 2 years ago. But that's one of those wins where you go, hey, long guy, big beard. But a good win for Alex Morono to get, especially to build confidence in the fact that his jiu-jitsu's there, and now his striking's come along. This should be an interesting fight because there's definitely a path of victory for both guys. Rhys McKee, if he can weather a storm and put it on Morono, especially in round 2 on, I think that's a perfect way for Rhys McKee to get a win because we've seen it. Alex Morono in the fight against Max Griffin, that second round, that was a 10-8. He poured it on, he had Max Griffin hurt. What did Max Griffin do in that 3rd round? We just poured it on Alex Morono, and Morono had a hard time with that pressure there.
He really did. Now, I don't know if we're going to see that same version of Morono, and this is why. I think Rhys McKee, the most important part of this fight, is the first takedown attempt. If he can stuff that first takedown, it's going to tell Alex Morono, listen, I'm not that guy from Bama who used to get taken down a lot. Because Rhys McKee doesn't have a lot of weaknesses. I mean, what are you going to do? Say his jiu-jitsu's bad? It's not. His striking's really good, too. And he does have this really long, kind of unique style that only people built like him can have. It's that kind of Neil Magny-esque version of striking where he's going to have that volume, but I would say Rhys McKee is better at putting pop behind his shots. If Rhys McKee does start to get you with a volume, he'll start to kind of go into his power mode where he sits back on his shots, and he can really hurt you. But if he can at least defend that first takedown, maybe first 2 takedowns, and force Alex Morono to strike with him, I do think this is going to be an absolutely wild fight, because Alex Morono, he can go out there and take the boring route. If he gets that first takedown, we're probably just going to see a lot of Alex Morono in top control on Rhys McKee. But if Rhys McKee can start defending them, really force this into a striking battle, and then look for his own takedowns, I think this could be a phenomenal fight.
Now, Matt, if we have a look at the odds on this one, we were a bit surprised before we started, and a little bit of inside baseball. We don't normally look at the odds before we start. We just kind of click on it and go, and it's as big of a surprise to us as it is to you. I look at this, Alex Morono opened a big favorite.
He did.
I was actually surprised by that. Open a minus 300 favorite. He's now a minus 190. A lot of money coming in on Rhys McKee. He opened a plus 250. He's now at a plus 158 over on Best Fight Odds. In terms of the overall predictions over on Tapology, 387 votes, so a limited sample size. 68% have Morono. 81% saying he's going to get the win by decision. So the fan vote is going the way of Morono, the safe route, the decision route. The odds, though, are starting to shift in on Northern Ireland's Rhys McKee. Is a win going to go back to the United Kingdom in this one?
I thought it was, and then I really started thinking about the fight. I started watching a lot of Alex Morono tape. Rhys McKee might be able to beat Alex Morono if all he does is strike. Alex Morono is really good at wrestling and grappling, though, and it's nothing against Rhys McKee, but Rhys McKee, he lacks the transitional skill in between his jiu-jitsu and his striking, and this is a thing that a lot of people in the UFC struggle with, but they've at least developed to the certain point where they found different weapons to combat their weakness. Rhys McKee, I think, has a higher ceiling than Alex Morono. If you give me the best version that Rhys McKee can possibly be versus the best version that Alex Morono could possibly be, Rhys McKee's probably going to win that fight. That's not what we're getting right now. Alex Morono is pretty much he's in his final form. He's not going to get that much better. He's just kind of good at everything. Like I was saying to Craig, he's like 6 out of 10 at everything. His jiu-jitsu's probably like an 8. He's just kind of good no matter where the fight goes. He can get it done at. Where Rhys McKee, it's like a 9 in striking, a 9 in jiu-jitsu, and then his wrestling's like a 1. Like he really, really misses out on that one aspect. So Alex Morono, if he's having success on the ground, can decide, I'm just going to take the fight to the ground. If he's having success on the feet, he can just decide, I'm going to keep the fight standing. And the fact that he has such that really an essential component that Rhys McKee lacks, I've got to pick Alex Morono in this fight.
And I mean, I agree with you, Matt. We haven't really agreed a whole lot so far on this card. But yeah, with Alex Morono, he's just a tricky fighter to try and beat. Now, of course, some people have Kaita Nakamura, a very diverse skill set. We're talking about Chaos Williams in the last fight. To use a possibly trademark phrase from Robin Black, fellow Canadian, so maybe I have his blessing. But Bink, he got him in that one. I mean, I look at this fight as Alex Morono, more well-rounded fighter, but if Rhys McKee's going to win, you have to remember, really good striking, very good jiu-jitsu, and maybe he tossed a straight shot up when Morono goes for a takedown attempt. But if he gets on his back, you saw it in the Chimaev fight. Now, that's an outlier because Chimaev's booked to fight a top 5 fighter, a top 3 fighter in Leon Edwards. I don't care about the UFC.
You might have heard of him.
You might have. Fabian has. I look at this fight as, is this the opportunity for McKee to really get back on the horse? Or is he really going to have to try and find himself if he loses? He's only 25 years old. Again, I think final form and final stage is way up there. I just have Alex Morono in this one. Much more diverse, more well-rounded. And again, he can really stymie on the feet. But again, if he starts to wrestle, you got to watch out. So in this fight, Matt, we both have Alex Morono to pick up the win. I'm really looking forward to it. You have it as your possible fight 100%. Of the night. We got a great card coming up this weekend, headlined by Islam Makhachev taking on Rafael dos Anjos. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. In this fight at Women's Strawweight, we have a couple of fighters looking to rebound off of a loss in one case and a couple of losses in the other, as the Spider Monkey, Ashley Yoder's taking on Danger Miranda Granger. And I'm really excited about this fight because Ashley Yoder's record might not be the best out there. A little salty at 7-6, but she does have some nice wins on that record. And if we have a look at it, there's a few that, maybe you scratch your head, but in her last 5, 3-2, she lost a split to Mackenzie Dern. She was competitive in that fight. Then she won 2 more. Amanda Bobby Cooper, losing record, but look into it. I mean, I hate to Eddie Bravo you, but you got to look into it and have a look at the level of competition that she faced in her run in the UFC. She beat Siri Kondo, no longer in the UFC. Lost a split decision to Randa Marcos. Had a really nice head and arm throw in that one against a good wrestler. We've talked about that in this playlist. Of course, Randa Markos on this card or on short notice. And then she lost to Lavinia Souza, who was coming off a long layoff. But there was one point in time where, honestly, I thought Lavinia Souza was like that next at 115 pounds. I don't think that's crazy to say. But she lost that fight, and it was all Souza. For Miranda Granger, former CFFC champion, we've seen a lot of CFFC fighters have success. I mean, look at the Dacus brothers recently. Look at other fighters. No, I'm just kidding. But there have been a lot of success stories. And oh, by the way, sometimes CM Punk commentates their events. Now, I look at this fight, and it's very interesting because these fighters are very close in terms of style. You look at this. I mean, 5'7" for Ashley Yoder. She's normally bigger and longer than a lot of fighters at strawweight. Miranda Granger is actually going to be very, very closely matched in this one. So it's one of those things that Yoder never really has to go up against long, rangy opponents in the UFC. There's been a lot of wrestlers. There's been some strikers. She's had success against both. For Miranda Granger, I go back and watch her first fight when she came into the UFC, gets a win over Hannah Goldie, really stymied Goldie's attack. And if you watched a lot of Hannah Goldie fights, she's very volume heavy. She can land some power. Miranda Granger just popping off those combinations. The double jab lands a nice right hand. She can throw some kicks. She can pressure her opponents. For Ashley Yoder, we know their kickboxing's good. She has a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt. Both of these fighters are kind of like carbon copies of each other. And to use a Mike Goldberg impression, it's basically CB Dollaway taking on CB Dollaway. I really like this matchup stylistically. I think it's one of the better ones that you can make for both of these fighters. What do you think about this one?
So I do think this will be a really fun fight, and mainly because it is going to be what you said. It's going to be basically a showcase of could you beat yourself if you shadow boxed in front of a mirror for 15 minutes? Because Miranda Granger, you look at kind of her skill set, and it doesn't really apply the same way that Ashley Yoder's does. Ashley Yoder should be probably a little bit more grappling heavy than Miranda Granger is, but Yoder really relies on that volume, her reach, her length in the division. And I do think it's important to mention now, she's never had to fight using that style to really use her height and reach as an advantage, because it does seem like in most of Yoder's fights, she's defending takedowns and trying to get off whatever strikes she can in the meantime. With Granger, I do feel like Miranda Granger fights like a 5'7" strawweight, whereas Ashley Yoder fights like a strawweight who happens to be 5'7". I do think that's a very important distinction between the two, because Ashley Yoder isn't the best at using her range. She gets Stefan Struve sometimes where people can come in on her. She has a really hard time finding the range. Now, I doubt she went to the Brian Ortega elbow camp, because Brian Ortega came out and said that. He was like, my first, so many UFC fights, I was having a really hard time punching people because I'm so big for the division, people are closing the distance. But if I just use elbows, I can meet them halfway and it's going to be a lot more damaging. If Ashley Yoder could do that, I'd be like, wow, Ashley Yoder going places. But we haven't really seen that evolution in her game, at least as of late. She is a good grappler, so I'm sure some of that is she kind of welcomes the takedown, because unless your name's Mackenzie Dern, you're probably going to be in some tricky situations on the ground with Yoder. But Miranda Granger, what she do well? Well, she got really good volume striking from a distance, very similar, to Ashley Yoder. Her power, though, I will say Granger has the power advantage out of the two. It just seems like she sits down on her shots a little bit more. And if she is able to she does have a really nice double jab into a straight right. Another thing Stefan Struve hasn't done in about 10 years in the UFC, although he's 7 feet tall. But she does have really good boxing combinations, and she uses her range. Because you can tell, when she's throwing a punch, she's fully expecting the end of her range to hit her opponent. She's not trying to throw inside of her own comfortable range. And I do think that's it's a good sign that you're a really high level striker when you have that level of control over your own body.
Now, for Miranda Granger, undefeated going into her last fight against Amanda Lemos, and if you want to see something that's absolutely insane, that woman made it from 135 pounds to 115 pounds, took a long time off, and got a giant win. And Amanda Lemos' jiu-jitsu is very, very slippery and skilled. And you look at that fight for Miranda Granger, she was a favorite at about a minus 190, and ended up losing by first-round submission. So she comes back in here. We know what her bread and butter is. It is definitely the striking. She does leave herself open to get hit by some of those looping shots and the power shots, but she definitely is a technical striker. I was a little bit surprised coming into this video seeing that Miranda Granger opened a minus 170 favorite, and all of the monies have come in on her opponent in this one. So you look at it, you have Miranda Granger, the line moves towards Ashley Yoder. Yoder at the time opened a plus 145. She's now a minus 117. If we look over at the votes on Tapology, Matt, out of 409 total votes, 83% going Granger, 81% predicting her to win by decision. That's how I see it, but I'm a little bit surprised on how those odds are moving.
I mean, I was when they had first opened. I don't think Miranda Granger... I'm really weird this way. I think you need to really justify that you deserve to be as much of a favorite as you are. I don't think you can just beat 5 people in a row and then you deserve to be a 2-1 favorite. I think you really have to go out there and put stamps in your performances to kind of warrant that. Whereas Miranda Granger, it's more a disrespect towards Ashley Yoder, honestly, that they opened the line at that. Them being even more than fair, because like we had said, they're basically carbon copies of each other. So it's either going to be, does Ashley Yoder out Ashley Yoder? Ashley Yoder? See, there's a lot going on. So I do think, though, Miranda Granger, she has the power advantage. She uses her striking a little bit better in MMA. So I do think Miranda Granger will probably be able to pick up a decision win. Like you had mentioned, though, she's open to getting hits. So as she starts to fight those upper echelon women in the strawweight division, something to look out for. But I don't think Ashley Yoder has nearly enough power to make her pay for it in this performance.
And maybe Ashley Yoder surprised a lot of people.
Maybe.
I mean, again, the takedowns, if they're there and she can get some of that top control in Miranda Granger, we know that Ashley Yoder's a half-decent striker. We've stressed that the entire video. There's definitely an opportunity and method of victory for Ashley Yoder. But again, I'm also siding with Miranda Granger in this one. But I am really looking forward to this fight. We both have Granger to get the win. It's a tricky card. I mean, the main event's fallen out, so we'll see what happens up near the top. But Makhachev, RDA, no more. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks all fight week long as we continue to follow the developments. It is an interesting time to be an MMA fan. We really appreciate you for tuning in. So again, hate to ask for it, but toss down the like and the sub and turn the notifications on. That way you know that when that breaking fight news comes out, we have an opportunity to cover it. You can check it out here. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say.
Let's get into it.
Really interesting fight at 115 pounds as we have Kay Hansen taking on Corey McKenna. This is Corey McKenna's UFC debut after coming in on Contender Series, getting a big win over Vanessa Demopoulos and earning that shot at the big show. And I mean, you might be familiar with her time over in Cage Warriors. You might be familiar with some of the wins that she's been able to rack off. The lone loss to Nicole DeSegni that we saw in Contender Series, we've seen with AFL in their Valkyrie series. And I mean, that one just a split decision loss. But again, Corey McKenna really stringing things together, made the move from Wales to Team Alpha Male, training with some of the best in the business, and we really stress that. And I know Jillian Robertson in some of the lower weight classes, she's left, she's with Dean Thomas and crew, but you look at the roster of fighters that's still there. Amanda Hebus, Amanda Nunes, and the list goes on and on. Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and so forth. And I mean, again, for Corey McKenna, first win as a pro, finish. Then she wins a split. She wins another finish over Fanny Redmond, 1-0. She wins another by finish, then comes in on Contender Series, earns the contract. Taking on Kay Hansen, and I mean, Matt, a lot of people were familiar with Kay Hansen from her time in Invicta. She was that fighter that came in. She was 19 years old. She was really going to put a statement on, and she has. I mean, 7-3, the total record. Her UFC debut against the former Invicta champ in Jinyu Fry. Huge win for Kay Hansen in that one. And I remember us breaking down that fight. If Fry was going to win, had to establish distance, get her strikes going. Kay Hansen got to push the pressure. And what did she do in that fight? Push the pressure.
Armbar.
I like this fight, but it seems like a fight that had to happen. Like, it seems like this was like behind the scenes. We were starting to write a narrative, and this was the storyline that we were ultimately going to get. Can you fill me in there?
So first of all, I would just like to announce something. I believe this is a fight night first. I'm older than both of these fighters, and I never thought I'd actually say that. I'm almost 22, so I think I have them both beat by just a little bit. But besides that, Kay Hansen fought a very similar fighter to Corey McKenna in her last fight, and I like how you prefaced it by that, because Jinyu Fry, what does she do well? She's a great striker. She has really good footwork on the outside, but her grappling is a bit of a weakness, and you knew that going into this fight, she was a little bit undersized, because Jinyu Fry, phenomenal fighter, should be fighting at 105, though. Kay Hansen, she was, I would say, extremely underdeveloped her first run in Invicta, but then she took a little bit of time off, just really worked on developing her MMA skill set, and really just kind of matured as a person over that time. She's come out and talked a lot about it. And her wrestling and really just her grappling are going to be a problem for a lot of women in this division. Because you have to think, at 21 years of age, she was all ready to submit a former champion in another organization. And say what you want about Invicta, but like, women's MMA doesn't really happen in that many places. And Invicta is one of the better opportunities for a lot of these athletes. So to beat a former champion coming out of there in Jinyu Fry, who is one of the more well-known fighters, and I would say kind of a face of the Invicta organization since Cyborg has left, that win was huge for me. And Corey McKenna, like you had said, it felt like this fight was going to get put together the second she had won on Contender Series. And I had friends over that night because I was really excited for a few of those. And I remember saying that. I was like, oh, she's going to fight Kay Hansen. And no one knew who Kay Hansen was. Then I had to explain that. But it really feels like they're doing one of these prospect versus prospects. And like, oh, whoever wins this is going to be like the next Macy Barber, if you will. Now, hopefully no one tears their ACL in their next fight. But Corey McKenna, I didn't think deserved a UFC contract after her Contender Series fight. I do think that it was more built in as to the narrative that, oh, we're going to have these two really young fighters afterwards fight each other. Because you look at who else got a contract that night. Well, TJ Laramie got one, really extensive background on the regionals. I know it didn't exactly go his way in his first fight in the UFC, but TJ Laramie, really high upside to him long term.
Let's just focus on Adrian Yanez.
Adrian Yanez is another guy, too. He's being called Tiny Jorge Masvidal for a reason. Not only does he look very similar to him, his striking's absurd, and he's a guy who I do really think can go a long ways in the UFC. So you have those two people getting contracts, and it's like, okay, that's good enough. I know Dana White loves to just give everyone the contracts on that show now, but please stop doing that. It's turned into a poppy mill. Corey McKenna, I didn't think deserved it. I do like this matchup for her in the UFC. I think if you're going to match her up against anyone at this stage in her career, this is the fight to do. I just think Kay Hansen's fought the much higher level of competition. I know she's got 2 more losses, and if you really do a deep dive into her career, maybe you're not happy with a lot of the wins, but you just have to look at what her skill set is capable of. Well, her skill set's capable of beating or submitting a former champion, and that's not something I'm confident saying Corey McKenna could do herself.
And I mean, Jinh Yu Frey was the atomweight champion there. I just want to make that one clear. So, I mean, maybe the step up to strawweight, it was an issue, but in her last 2 fights, even the fight that she had against Loma Lookboonmee, it just didn't work out for her there. So, Jinh Yu Frey, late in her career too, but still, Kay Hansen putting on very impressive performances. The Corey McKenna fight that she had against Vanessa Demopoulos, definitely a good win. There are a couple of fluky spots. I know back in the first round, she kind of caught her with a bit of a punch. Demopoulos, whether she got hit and rocked or whether she just kind of slipped, she was down.
She rolled for a knee.
Corey McKenna has really good top pressure. You saw that throughout that fight, but it wasn't one of those impressive performances where you went, geez, that left me with a good taste in my mouth. It was kind of like, hey, Brendan Loughnane didn't get a contract. Chris Curtis didn't get one, but Corey McKenna gets one? But hey, you want to build up the strawweight division. This is definitely a good name to have in Corey McKenna. And I mean, I look at this fight, I look at the odds. Maybe you scratch your head a little bit. I mean, Kay Hansen, open to -130. That's where the head scratching starts. And then that line dropped and it's evened out. Kay Hansen now -222 favorite. For Corey McKenna, open to +110. She's now at a +180. If we have a look over on Tapology, out of the total votes, 423, 79% of Hansen, 66% saying she's going to win by decision. I think Kay Hansen has a very good opportunity in this fight, and I will leave it at that.
I think Kay Hansen's going to win, and probably by submission. Corey McKenna, if she does incorporate the same style that she used against Demopoulos, I'm not saying she will, but if she does go out there expecting to get a lot of top control, really pressure the fight towards Kay Hansen, it's going to be a very different fight. And I do think the same thing can be said for McKenna. It's not like she fought a true strawweight in her last fight. Demopoulos is not the biggest fighter you're ever going to see. Very small for the division. So I do think you can take a lot from each competitor's last fight and kind of bring it into this one, but Kay Hansen, I do think the grappling acumen is going to be a little bit too much for McKenna. I've liked what I've seen from Hansen's striking. I do think it's developed a lot in the short amount of time she's had to really work on it. Corey McKenna, I will still say, is the better striker out of these two. She does have fairly good boxing and throws good combinations.
Which is a huge surprise because honestly, and I'm sure the broadcast will talk about this and I'll have to do my research for Question Mark Kicks on Saturday. I don't think I've ever seen a fighter in the UFC with a reach that's less than 60 inches at 58.5 inches. That's insane.
Now, luckily, she's fighting someone with a 63-inch reach, so it's not like she's fighting Slenderman on the other side, but I do think Kay Hansen, the grappling should be enough. I like her experience against upper or higher level competition, and I do think that it's well to say that I do think fight IQ is going to be the reason that a 21-year-old is going to get the win, but we're dealing with two fairly young fighters. I just like the upside of Kay Hansen a little bit more.
Matt, really looking forward to this fight. We both have Kay Hansen. It's an interesting card. It's going to move. There's a lot of moving pieces. Barberena out against Rodriguez. Rodriguez against TBD. Then you have a main event that's also TBD. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. Make sure you check in during the week. We're really looking forward to it, and we'll have coverage all week long. So as I said, keep it locked in. And Matt, as we always do say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Late edition, and I'm sure there's plenty that are going to be announced this week, as we have All In Brendan Allen taking on Tarzan Sean Strickland. Cue up the Baltimora. But hey, for Sean Strickland on the right-hand side, he had a really big fight against Jack Marshman just a couple of weeks ago, put on a statement win, and he'd been away for a couple of years training out of Syndicate. He's been a long-time Kings MMA guy as well. But again, the reason why he was off for so long, had a terrible motorcycle accident. He's a thrill seeker. He's a thrill junkie. He's still riding motorcycles because he's a wild man. But in that performance, moving back up to middleweight, you recognize him in the UFC as a welterweight, but moving back up to middleweight where he's a former champ with King of the Cage, he looked great. He looked bodied up. I mean, that picture over there on the right-hand side, that's a new picture of Sean Strickland, but you heard us in our video saying that he looked like a brick shithouse, and he did. And he put on a great performance. Now, it was a great performance short of a finish, but when you're pointing at Jack Marshman, getting him to bring the fight to you, and not cussing him out, but playing those games, playing the hand games like Max Holloway against Brian Ortega, it was a really good comeback performance for Sean Strickland. Now, for Brendan Allen on the left-hand side, Matt, we were really excited for his fight against Ian Heinisch. You went as far as saying that was your fight of the night.
Easily.
For last weekend, unfortunately, that fight fell out. For Brendan Allen, he's really excited about this fight. He posted about it on Instagram this afternoon. For Sean Strickland, I'm sure that feeling is mutual. Now, Matt, this card overall, maybe not the most stacked in terms of name value. Definitely the fact that you lost Khabib's protege in Islam Makhachev in the main event. RDA scrambling for an opponent. He says maybe he'll take a fight at 170 pounds. But, I mean, you look at the guy, he's bodied up, and he's already on his way to make the cut for 55. So it's probably not going to happen. If you were to give this card a letter grade, I'm probably not going to give it the best one that I've given a card in a long time. It's not one of the better cards. But this is one of those fights that you get up for, you get excited about, and I'm already looking forward to it. And, hey, both of these guys, different skill sets. For Brendan Allen, 24 years old, the level of competition he's faced and the amount of fights that he's had, you're not going to see a lot of 24-year-olds with that type of resume. For Sean Strickland, already 21-3, and I mean, since he's been in the UFC, he's 8-3 so far. That level of competition as well. The losses, Santiago Ponzinibbio, Kamaru Usman, and Eliseu Zaleski dos Santos. Pretty good company.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And this fight is probably going to be the new fight of the night on the card. Sean Strickland and Brendan Allen, they're equally effective, but in very different ways. Sean Strickland, he was known sort of as that Neil Magny type body type at 170, sort of a tall, thin guy, had really good striking at range. And those 2 years off, yes, it was to recover from the motorcycle accident, but the thing that I like about Sean Strickland moving up to 185, it's not like when Max Holloway moved up to 155 to fight Dustin. It was like, okay, it's a featherweight, he hasn't really grown into 155. Sean Strickland took those 2 years to really build his frame into a 185er, and you could tell 100% in the Jack Marshman fight, because Jack Marshman, he's a thick 185er, and Sean Strickland matched up really well physically with him. Now, outstriking Jack Marshman on the outside, which is Sean Strickland's kind of bread and butter and his game plan, is one thing. Brendan Allen's going to come with a completely different skill set and game plan from a guy like Jack Marshman. Brendan Allen, if he gets you on the ground for any period of time, and I really do mean like 30 seconds to a minute, the combination of ground and pound and submission threat is just phenomenal, because a lot of guys, they're either one or the other. There are people like Khabib, of course, who when they get on top of you, they're just going to beat you up until they get the submission. Brendan Allen can go for either. He gets into a really dominant position, has really heavy top pressure, kind of like Glover Teixeira, just to bring up a familiar name from recent. And if he does get on top of Sean Strickland, he is going to really, really damage him, to the point where Sean Strickland, who I do think has the cardio edge over Brendan Allen, might start to wear down as this fight goes on. Because Brendan Allen, we saw it in the Kyle Dawkins fight, his striking actually looked really good in that fight. It looked better than it had in previous ones. But he did start to tire as that fight progressed. Now, you can say, well, he had his opponent hurt. He really exerted a lot of energy going for the finish. And you would be right there, but it is something to watch out against a guy in Strickland who he can really kind of weaponize his pace. And if he is able to defend a lot of those takedowns and force Brendan Allen to work on the outside with him, Sean Strickland's combinations are really going to start piecing Brendan Allen up.
We talk about a lot of guys, and I mean, Matt, I'm sure there's some names that you can think of off the top of your head that stay on their bike, and they're very consistent when they fight. And if you look at Sean Strickland's run in the UFC, we'll talk about some of the names, because, again, he has the bigger body of work. 11 total fights. He beats Bubba McDaniel in his debut, submits him. Beats Luke Barnett by split decision, big slow. Then he loses to Ponzinibbio by decision. Then he beats Igor Araujo by decision. He finishes Alex Garcia. I think that's a really big win. You know Cuba. You know the wrestlers. You know Alex Garcia. He beats Tom Breeze by split decision. Loses to Usman by decision. Beats Court McGee by decision. Gets knocked out by Eliseu in a highlight reel loss. Knocks out Nordin Taleb, and then he has that fight against Marshman. The thing to me, you can see that consistency is there for Sean Strickland. You saw that in the fight against Marshman. It was just a steady output until the end when he really wanted to throw down and show what he could do, especially near the end of that fight. I mean, He beat Jack Marshman up in that one. And you look at it, I mean, in terms of the total...
he joins a long line of people, though, who have done that in the UFC. No disrespect to Jack Marshman, but striking on the outside against him is very different than doing that against another guy who I would consider in the somewhat elite of the middleweight division.
And the thing with Sean Strickland, too, out of that fight, 83% of his total strikes were to the head. All of his strikes were considered significant strikes. And again, 46% to Marshman's 19%. It was just a masterclass of a performance coming back. That's what you want to highlight. For me, too, the other things that I really like about Sean Strickland are his strikes absorbed to strikes absorbed to landed ratio. He's landing much more than he absorbs at very decent percentages. The striking defense is great at 67%. He might not be the most accurate guy, but he's always going to throw that volume at you. And especially in this fight, what I want to highlight is the fact that his takedown defense at 81%. He has faced good wrestlers. Kamaru Usman's one of them. And again, Alex Garcia is another one. You look at the fight against Usman, he did get taken down a number of times. He got taken down twice. And in the Alex Garcia fight, he got taken down 3 times, but he ended up submitting Garcia. I really do like that. Combined with that steady pace on the feet, you know it's there. For Brendan Allen, though, Matt, and this was something that we talked about before we started the video, he's faced a really good level of competition all the way up through. It's not like he was just fed absolute scrubs. And so far in the UFC, he's faced a healthy dose of differing skill sets. I mean, you look at it, the Aaron Jeffrey win of Contender Series, I think was huge because we've seen Aaron Jeffrey learning from that loss and continuing to win. Then he fights Holland, then Breeze, then Dawkins. I don't think he got 100% Tom Breeze like we saw Breeze in the fight against KB Bowler, but the Dawkins, Breeze, and Holland wins are huge for if you're a big Brendan Allen supporter.
They really are, and the Kevin Holland win too, because Kevin Holland does strike in a similar manner to Sean Strickland. I would argue Kevin Holland has a lot more power than Sean Strickland, because Kevin Holland's got that weird whip on the end of his shots where he's tall and thin, but for some reason he can drop people. And to go out there and submit a guy like Kevin Holland, who we've seen in the UFC, he's a pretty good black belt himself. Sean Strickland, yes, he submitted Alex Garcia. If you think Sean Strickland's going to submit Brendan Allen, you've got another thing coming, as I forget what band sang that because I'm a young person, but I think Brendan Allen, if he is able to get top position, worst case scenario, he is just going to win the rounds. I know Sean Strickland's fought good wrestlers in the past. There's a good wrestlers at 170 though, and a really top level wrestler at 185. If he is able to get that top pressure and that top control, I just don't see Sean Strickland being able to scramble out from underneath him. And I do think that the ground and pound and just the overall physicality of Brendan Allen's game will start to wear on Sean Strickland to the point where his cardio advantage will play so much of a factor later on down the stretch.
I mean, Rob Halford and the fans of Judas Priest are definitely going to be very upset at you, but they're also going to be upset at you for another reason. I mean, Sean Strickland, a lot of his career has taken place in middleweight. Again, I referenced it, but former King of the Cage middleweight champ. He has a lot of experience on the regional scene at middleweight, and I think the move up has paid just immediate dividends. You saw it in the last fight, but again, cardio's never really been an issue, and I think adding that extra weight's only going to help him. It's not like his hand speed went off a cliff moving up. I think it's only helped. I really like Sean Strickland in this fight. Again, we don't have Tapology votes. We don't have odds to go off of. If I had to guess on this one, Brendan Allen, Ian Heinisch were par odds at the time that the fight was taken off. I think a fight like this is going to be pretty close. Who would you edge, or who do you anticipate will be the favorite in this one?
And not just because I am predicting Brendan Allen to win, but just the fact that he was supposed to fight a ranked guy. And not that Sean Strickland's a big drop-off from Ian Heinisch in any aspect. And I gotta be honest, I'm picking Brendan Allen, but this fight could go completely either way. Like, Sean Strickland's a very dangerous guy to be fighting, but I see him as, skill-wise, he's not really any lesser than Ian Heinisch. Like, they just have different skill sets, but they do a lot of the same stuff. It's just the fact that he doesn't have that number next to his name. Odds makers might give Brendan Allen a slight edge. He might be like a minus 150 to 170, but it should be pretty close odds-wise. These guys are going to put on a great show.
I think it's going to be a great show, too. And a little bit of behind-the-curtain inside baseball, as I love to say. But I look at this, and Matt, you kind of talked a little bit more about Brendan Allen. I talked a little bit more about Sean Strickland. But overall, this fight's amazing. It's tough to pick either one of these guys. And, I mean, if I can focus on Brendan Allen just a little bit, Matt, I look at his overall body of work. And, again, you only have the stats from those 4 fights, and they're going to be a little biased, but I do like the fact that Brendan Allen has that fight against Kevin Holland, that of course is a win, and you see what kind of a run Kevin Holland's on. I mean, imagine if Brendan Allen was just a little bit more active and followed the Kevin Holland route.
Exactly.
Holland's getting number 4 ranked Jack Hermanson in a main event slot.
Like, Brendan Allen could beat Joaquin Buckley on a week's notice. I'm sorry, but he could. So he could probably be in the same position. No,
so, I mean, Brendan Allen, you look at those wins. I don't think Tom Breeze was 100%. So there is that. I discount that one a little bit.
Is good,
the Kevin Holland fight, Allen, what I like in that fight is that he showed resolve. You could take it as, well, he got knocked down and he was cracked and he was bloodied, and maybe that fight, if it ended, like if the second round went on, maybe the doctor would have ended it. I don't know. You never know. We talking ifs and ands or buts. But Brendan Allen submitted him in that fight. That was amazing. And we know how good Kevin Holland's jiu-jitsu is pretty good. I mean, look, he's coming out of Travis Luter's camp. He's been there for a very long time, enough to get that black belt. So for Allen to have that win on his record, I love it. He's faced fighters like Sean Strickland before. He's beaten fighters like Sean Strickland before. So I wouldn't discount or take anything away from somebody that would say that Brendan Allen might not win this fight. Or sorry, that Sean Strickland might not win this fight. I like Strickland in this fight because Kevin Holland rocked Brendan Allen, and I love the fact that Sean Strickland has that body of work against wrestlers where, all right, you've lost to Ponzinibbio, you lost to Usman, you're on Elizeu's highlight reel. Everybody's lost to Kamaru Usman.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody's lost to Kamaru Usman. Sean Strickland has picked up the pieces, and I really like how he came out in his last fight and put on that statement. I like Sean Strickland in this fight because, again, the takedown defense is there. The forward pressure is there. The striking's there, and the cardio's there. Where for Brendan Allen in that fight against Kyle Daukaus, look, I think Kyle Daukaus has a very high ceiling in this sport. I think he wasn't just some guy that they picked up from CFFC and went, hey, you had a good performance. Let's just grab your brother, too. Because, I mean, hey, if ESPN called us tomorrow, they're probably going to take one of us. They'll take one, and hopefully the other one petitions for the other. But, I mean, hey, it's a cutthroat business. I probably won't. No, I'm kidding. But I look at this one, and the Daukaus brothers are great. But for Kyle in the fight against Brendan Allen, he really brought it to Allen. And when we started to get into the second round and the third round, that's when it started to kind of all go a little bit more in Daukaus' realm. I like Strickland in this fight for that reason. You're going to get a steady, consistent guy with good takedown defense. You get a guy that can throw the volume with a little bit of power on his shots. I like Strickland. You've got Allen.
I hate myself for what I'm about to do. Brendan Allen's a lock of the week. I'm bringing it back. Romanov was last week. Brendan Allen has this in the bag. The physicality of his game is going to be too much for Sean Strickland. It's one thing to look good against Jack Marshman at middleweight. It's another thing to look good against Brendan Allen, who's been preparing against a guy who was training in Thailand and Ian Heinisch. So he's going to be more than prepared for that Muay Thai style and the boxing of Sean Strickland. I am so confident the Brendan Allen pick is not even
trained in Muay Thai for one fight and had to leave the camp because of COVID. Yep. And then in the
Brendan Allen would be expecting the same style out of Ian Heinisch, and he's going to be getting out of Sean Strickland.
Sean Strickland had 2 years off because of a horrific motorcycle accident, and they gave him a tune-up fight. So I'm fine with tune-up Strickland. I think he looks great. Matt, you're going with Brendan Allen. You're calling it a lock of the night, even though you said it was a really close fight. So take that for what it's worth. I think that this card, we're going to get some more late notice additions that, hey, I mean, this possible fight of the night. So if we can get 2 or 3 more of these types of fights, we're all over it. And as they progress and as they are announced, make sure you keep it locked in with Fight Night picks. Every now and again, we have a little bit of animosity between the picks. But I'm really looking forward to this weekend. We've got Question Mark Kicks on Saturday. That's our live show. Maybe one of these two guys has a bad weight cut. Maybe something happens during the week. Maybe some fights fall out. You got to check out that show where we lock in our final picks of the week. It happens an hour before the prelims start. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. Really interesting fight at 185 pounds is we have your boy Eric Anders, the guy that's main evented a spot in the hometown of his opponent in one instance, but his main evented twice, taking on Brazil's Antonio Arroyo. And Matt, with Antonio Arroyo, we've seen him twice. He did the old Ole on Dana White's Contender Series. Picked up a win, then picked up another win, gets the contract, takes on a former Contender Series alum in Andrea Muniz, and loses emphatically. He lost that fight by decision, but it definitely wasn't a good performance. And for Antonio Arroyo, this was always the talking point. And maybe you don't know him, so here it is. They compare him to Thiago Santos. He's a guy that they bring in to a lot of different camps to replicate Thiago Santos with his size and his length at 185 pounds.
Phenomenal.
He's got good striking. He's a dynamic guy on the feet. Plenty of finish wins. 9-3 overall record. He's taking on a wrestler in Eric Anders, and I went back and I got called out on Twitter, and the person that called me out was 100% right. We went back and watched some Eric Anders tape for this one, and specifically watched the fight against Lyoto Machida.
Are you finally going to admit this?
With Eric Anders, he took on a striker in Lyoto Machida. It was a really close fight. I've held on to the fact that Eric Anders beat Lyoto Machida in that fight. Well, since it happened, I mean, Machida won that fight.
Thank you.
Machida won that fight.
I've waited years for this guy.
You look at this one, and Eric Anders, I mean, at a certain point, had a spectacular, pristine record. He was undefeated. He was 10-0 going into the Machida fight. He loses split decision. He beats Tim Williams in a fight where we saw that kick replicated last week when Derek Anderson fought Kili Smota over with Bellator at 251, where they used the replay to see if it was a legal kick. Eric Anders in his fight against Tim Williams, similar thing where Williams was pushing up. Anders lands a kick that's almost a soccer kick. It's like millimeters away from being a soccer kick, but it wasn't. Then he loses to Thiago Santos. He loses split decision to Elias Theodorou. He loses to Khalil Roundtree.
K1 Khalil.
K1 Khalil. He beats Vinicius Moreira. Not that great. And then he beats Gerald Meerschaert by split decision. And then he loses to Christoph Jotko. Striker in Jotko, striker in Roundtree when he's Bangkok ready, Khalil Roundtree, striker in Elias Theodorou, striker in Thiago Santos, striker in Lyoto Machida. If you notice a theme here, Eric Anders struggles against volume-heavy and also powerful strikers, too.
I agree with all of that. If you really want to see two guys just throw single shots until one of them lands, this is the fight for you. Because Eric Anders is not really a volume-heavy guy, but you know, and yes, they're going to bring it up. Did you know Eric Anders actually knows?
Roll Tide!
Thank you. Did you know he knows? I can't even think of the... Nick Saban? Goodness, that was bad. He did play at... Alabama, goodness. I don't pay attention to football. I don't know if you guys have noticed.
Won a national championship.
Don't know if you've heard. So, and they're going to bring it up in every promo, but you really have to forget about that. He's an MMA fighter now. He's more of an MMA fighter than he was a football player at this point, because at least he's pro now in MMA. I like the upside of Eric Anders at his best. I really do. You look at him on the ground, and people don't really mention this enough. Eric Anders is a really good grappler, competes in jiu-jitsu tournaments all the time, and I think that's an important fact, because we see this a lot. I hate Thiago Santos in these videos, it sounds. Thiago Santos is a good example, though. He has a black belt, and I can put that in quotations, because you know who else is a black belt? Damian Maia, Brian Ortega. You know, guys who are phenomenal on the ground who never have issues in the grappling department. Thiago Santos is a black belt, and he doesn't really move on the ground. Eric Anders, I think he might only be listed as either having a purple or a brown belt, but you actually look and he's competing in tournaments constantly under his own weight class and open weight and different levels of tournaments. So I think having a brown belt in which you actually compete under is much more important than just having a black belt. So if you hear Eric Anders not having that black belt in jiu-jitsu, don't be worried. He's actually got a really well-rounded ground game. The wrestling for him has always been kind of one of those weird areas, and you can tell that he's such a big, strong, physical guy that he monitors his cardio almost a little bit too much because he never wants to overexert himself really going for that finish unless he knows he's about to get it, because he's been known to gas out in some fights. The Tim Williams fight is a good one to bring up because he was this massive favorite going into the Tim Williams fight, and then it just seemed like Tim Williams would just never go away, would never go away. And as the fight progressed, not that you thought Tim Williams was going to finish Eric Anders by any means, but as the fight was going on, you're like, okay, Eric Anders starting to slow down, Tim Williams starting to, speed up, like this is looking bad. And then, of course, Anders knocks him out with that really highlight reel knockout. We all forget about what happened up until that point, though. Antonio Hoya, I mean, like you had said, he's a budget Thiago Santos if you were looking for him at Kirkland. He does a lot of the things Santos does well. The one issue I have with Arroyo, though, is that he doesn't have those follow-up shots. He is just a strictly single-shot guy, whereas Santos, he'll throw some combinations, then kind of wait. Arroyo just throws that one big shot, and then he'll kind of like wait and admire his work for a second, move and do it again. Now, when he does recharge and throw that one shot, you better move out of the way, because he is absolutely massive for this weight division. Eric Anders, though, he's fought guys who can do that. And I do like what you had said. Eric Anders struggles against striker, and Antonio Hoyo definitely is a striker, but he's not a volume striker like the Machidas or the Theodoros or any of those other guys that Anders had trouble with. He's more that single-shot guy, and if you're just going single-shot with Eric Anders, I don't think it's a fight he's going to lose.
This is a trouble for me with Antonio Hoyo. I look at his record, and sometimes we focus on this a little bit too much. Sometimes we don't focus on it enough. Antonio Hoyo makes his debut against a guy that's 0-1. Then he fights an 0-0. That's fair. Fights a guy that's 4-5. That's good. Then he loses to Bredson Ribeiro, who's 3-0. It's going to happen. Then he beats a guy that's 0-0. Then he loses to a guy that's 2-0. He fights a guy that's 11-2. I dare you to look up Trevor Carlson on Tapology. he was taking some of that Mike's special sauce, and it's a bit of a salty 11-2. So he wins that fight. Then he gets matched up against the guy that's 2-4, then 1-1, then 8-3. That's on Contender Series, so it counts. That's a good win. Then he beats Steven Regman, who's 9-3. All right, decent win. Then he loses to a submission specialist in Andrea Muniz. Then I look at the fights that have fallen through for Antonio Hoyo. Alessio Di Chirico withdraws. Kevin Holland gets hurt, can't make it. Then you had Antonio Hoyo was supposed to take on Trevin Giles earlier this year. Antonio Hoyo out. Tapology has it listed as issues, after the weight cut. So I don't really love that, especially going into a fight with Eric Anders. He was originally supposed to take on Andreas Michailidis. That fight fell through. In steps Anders. As far as Hoyo getting ready for this fight against Anders, Michailidis, pretty good grappler, pretty good striking. So Hoyo's already got the meat and potatoes of camp ready for a guy like Michailidis to switch it into a different gear and take on Eric Anders. Eric Anders is a tougher test than Andreas Michailidis. I have to say that right now. I mean, Michailidis, his last fight against Modestas Bukauskas, a lot of people were high on him.
And just
he was up.
That means a lot coming from Craig. I would say we're down on Eric Anders more than the average fan, and for him to admit that, that's a big stepping stone.
There's a lot of stuff in here that are that's a first. But for Andreas Michailidis going into his fight with Bukauskas, a lot of people were excited about him and what he had done at 85. This would have been the opportunity to see 100% Michailidis. So for Greek MMA fans, hopefully get your guy back. But for this fight, Antonio Hoyo and Eric Anders, I look at the odds. Anders open to -170. A lot of people are going with a Hoyo to the tune of the fact that Anders now -147. For Antonio Hoyo, open +145. He's now +122 underdog. The votes over on Tapology have 417 total votes. 80% have Anders. 61% by decision. There's people that are going with a Hoyo, and they're out there, and if you're one of those people, let us know down below in the comments, because typically the people that are going with the underdog or the downtrodden are the most vocal in the comments, and we respect that, and we appreciate that. And Anders does struggle with those strikers. I just don't see this being that type of fight.
I agree with a lot of what you said, but I will have kind of the one path to victory for Hoyo if you do think he's going to win. The leg kicks. We saw Khalil Rountree coming back from Thailand, and he just became Bruce Lee overnight, and he absolutely destroyed the front leg of Eric Anders to the point where it really opened up a lot of his other striking. I don't think Hoyo has that speed that Rountree had in that one fight. It's really a bit of an outlier for Khalil, but either way, if he is able to use those low calf kicks in a similar way, I don't see Anders being able to just check those overnight. I know he's had a little bit of time since that fight, but that was such a big issue that I do think it'll take a few fights for him to really get down his defense with those techniques. So I think that could be a really nice move and a really nice technique for Hoyo as the fight progresses, but I really have to go with the overall game of Eric Anders or just the leg kicks of Hoyo.
And if I can focus a little bit more, because I don't think I did enough on Eric Anders, I look at some of the wins. Brendan Allen beats him in LFA, becomes a middleweight champ. Then he beats Rafael Natal, so you beat a decent grappler. You beat Marcus Perez and you take his O. That's a decent win. And a guy that's not similar to Hoyo, but Marcus Perez, he hits hard, he throws more single shots than anything. Cue up Dricus du Plessis. Then he loses to Machida, it's going to happen, and so on and so forth. So for Eric Anders, it's that strength of schedule. You might not have beaten some of those guys. The Santos fight up at, a main event slot where, that was a tough look, but still, I have Anders in this one. I'm looking forward to it. It should be a good one. And if Antonio Hoyo really connects on a power shot, there's definitely a path to victory for both of these guys. So I'm really looking forward to it. We both have Eric Anders to get the win, bringing it back to Alabama, SBG Alabama to be specific. And it's a great card. It's a really interesting card. A lot of under-the-radar fights that maybe a lot of people aren't getting up for in the morning. But hey, I'm drinking my morning coffee, I'm eating my toast, and I'm hanging out with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, keep it locked in with the channel. We'll have some more stuff popping off this week. So keep it locked in. As we always do say, let's get into it. Really interesting fight at 185 pounds is we have the return of the Cuban Missile Crisis. No, not the one from the 60s. Julian Marquez, and he's taking on Russia's Saparbeig Safarov. And Matt, I went through this all week. Is it Saparbek Safarov or is it Saparbeig Safarov? I went with Saparbeig because that's how he spells it on his Instagrams. And maybe we'll find out this week. Maybe that'll be one of the more interesting things in MMA.
This could be the main event.
As far as this fight is concerned, with Saparbeig Safarov, you look at his UFC run, he's 1-3. And the level of competition is kind of baffling. So he comes into the UFC undefeated, fights Jean Vellante, loses by finish. Then he fights Tyson Pedro. He loses that one by first round Kimura. Then he fights Nick Negumereanu and wins. And then he fights Rodolfo Vieira and predictably loses. It's in our highlight reel on the channel. It's our little intro. For Julian Marquez, I mean, you look at the record, 7-2. It's been a really long time. I mean, over 2 years since he fought Alessio Di Chirico. Before that, he had some really nice wins. He beat Matt Hamill, you know, the guy that beat John Jones. Then he beat Cameron Olson. He beat Phil Hawes, who looked amazing in a pay-per-view slot against Jacob Malkoun. And they made you pay for that fight. Remember that time Phil Hawes beat 4-0 Jacob Malkoun, who was a training partner of Robert Whittaker? I'll never forget it. I'm salty about it now. I'll be salty about it in 10 years, and it's one of those things that's going to stick in my dome. And then for Julian Marquez, he beats Darren Stewart in a fight that was crazy, because Darren Stewart, it was like, hey, you got 1 foot out the door. You got to win this fight. Well, he didn't win that one, but he won his next one. It was an amazing fight. It was a really entertaining fight. The trouble with Julian Marquez that he had in that Alessio Di Chirico fight was his gas tank, and it just didn't last, and it ended up costing him, and he loses a split decision there. So he comes back after all this time. He's got that podcast with Kendra Lust. You know Kendra Lust. And in this one, he's taking on Saprabeg Safarov. Matt, the one thing I'll say about my guy Saprabeg Safarov, that Nick Negumereanu fight, he beat Negumereanu, and then 2 weeks later, Negumereanu was out of the UFC after his UFC debut, slated to compete in ACA. You want to see a salty record? Look at Nick Negumereanu's record. Saprabeg Safarov hasn't done a single thing to impress me in the UFC. Granted, he has 4 fights already. He's getting his 5th. I'm never going to sniff the octagon as far as fighting. And he's got to win, too.
I hope never.
And he's got to win.
Just to clarify, I hope you never sniff the octagon.
I won't. You have my word. Here, gentleman's
Perfect.
agreement.
Craig will be a creep next time he sees a cage. So
This is a tough fight.
It really is, because there's so many unknowns, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that Saprabeg Safarov is one of the worst fighters to ever get 5 fights in the promotion. And I don't mean that to sound as harsh as it is, but it just really is. And yes, you could even look at the people who he's lost to. At one point, Tyson Pedro, pretty hyped up prospect. Rodolfo Vieira, he's a terrifying human. You get knocked out by Jean Vellante, though. That's when we have, we're going to have a conversation. I haven't seen any part of his game that really wows me. And I'm not just trying to be hard on him. It's just the truth. When you go back and really look at the overall aspect of what his MMA game is made up of, he's got borderline wrestling. He's got okay stamina. He's got okay pretty much everything. But his punches look like they're being thrown in cold molasses. He just has such this labored pace to the way in which he fights that... Yes, Julian Marquez, by the end of the fight, he looks exhausted. At least he doesn't start the fight looking tired. Where Safarov, the best moment of his UFC career, at the start of the Tyson Pedro fight, he kind of had him in a weird position, and then Tyson Pedro just cranked on a Kimura so hard that it reversed him, and then he submitted him with it. So Julian Marquez, I don't think he's going to go out there and wow you with his striking. We saw that in the Di Chirico fight. It wasn't even like he had a high volume in that fight, and he was throwing a ton of strikes like Paulo Costa did against Yoel, to where in the 3rd round you're like, Costa's tired, but it makes sense. He threw 400 punches. Marquez and Di Chirico didn't have a crazy high output or anything, didn't go for a lot of takedown attempts, and he's still just... Julian Marquez is in that weird group where it's just all of a sudden, and it's not always in the 1st round, it's not always in the 3rd round, he just looks like he's taking heavy breaths, and the fight just kind of slips away from him at that point. Now, he beat Darren Stewart. I think if you can beat Darren Stewart, you can beat Saprabeg Safarov. And that's really what my breakdown comes down to. Saprabeg, he does a lot of the things Stewart does. He just doesn't have the wrestling and the grappling. He can use it offensively to a certain degree, but I don't think that if Marquez is on top of him, I don't think he's going to be able to explode up to his feet. I just see Marquez as a lot more dominant positions that he can use against Saprabeg Safarov than Safarov can use against Marquez.
I look at Saprabeg Safarov, and you're going to see these graphics rotate in and out. We put them together, and as far as those UFC stats are concerned, we talk about them, but you have to take certain things with a grain of salt. So he's 1-3, bear that in mind, and of those 3 losses, all of them by finish. So why are his striking stats, why does he have such a good strike differential? Why does he have such a good average? Why does he have a good takedown average? It's all because of that one fight against Nick Negumereanu. If you look at his overall fights in terms of strikes, he get outstruck by Jean Vellante 60-37. He get outstruck by Tyson Pedro until it finished. So those are significant strikes. He outstruck Negumereanu 70-11 and took him down 3 times. And then he got finished by Rodolfo Vieira very early on in their fight. For Julian Marquez, again, as long as these 2 years off have helped him out somewhat, and he's worked on his cardio even a little bit, he should be able to get a win in this fight. I mean, I have a look at the odds here, and maybe not the biggest of surprises in terms of who's the favorite. I am a little surprised that Julian Marquez is as big of a favorite as he is because he opened a -200. That line dropped so quick that he's now at about a -295. If we have a look at Saprabeg Safarov, open +170, now at a +234. In terms of the total picks on Tapology, at a 430, 92% with Marquez, 79% with Marquez by knockout. I think Marquez gets the win here. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. We didn't need to take 6 minutes of your time, so apologies. But yeah, overall, I have Marquez in this one.
I think Safarov does have a path to victory. I do think his offensive wrestling might give Marquez some issues to the point where he might be able to fatigue Marquez to kind of bring him down to his level. But Marquez, I think he's got the better jiu-jitsu. He has the much higher chance of finishing Safarov than Safarov does of finishing him. So yeah, I agree. I've got Marquez all.
And I mean, Saprabeg Safarov was kind of like those, he's a guy at 205. Now he's at 185. Did the move to 185 help him a lot? Like, did he gain a whole lot of speed?
I mean, he seems rejuvenated to me.
So we'll see what happens. We both have Julian Marquez. It's a card. It's going to happen. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. It's been an incredible 3-week stretch.
It has been.
Just have a look down below at the prediction totals for this year. It's been a lot of fun here, and it's all because of the great fans and people tuning in out there. So if you can toss us a sub, you can toss us a like. We really do appreciate it. Let us know below in the videos who you have to win this one. We try to get into the comments as best we can to facilitate the discussion. It should be a great week of fights. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. We had fight of the nights that were kind of under the radar. Like, I had Jose Quinones in his fight against a really tough out in, of course, Louis Smolka. And Matt, you had Reese McKee in a very marquee type of matchup in his second time out. And who's he taking on?
Alex Morono in what should be an extremely fun fight.
And the reason why I asked you that is because Chaos Williams on our right-hand side took on Alex Morono in his UFC debut. And it was a fight where a lot of people, us included, had written off Chaos Williams. Yep. I mean, you look at Chaos Williams' record outside of the UFC, and he beat some less than stellar guys. He beat him in impressive fashion, but less than stellar overall records. He comes in there, throws absolute windmill cannons, and lands with just about every single one of them, except for that 3-punch flurry at the start when he planted.
It was cute.
But other than that, Chaos Williams looked amazing in that fight. And for Abdulrazak Alhassan, we both had him to win against Munir Lazzez. Only thing is, Munir Lazzez, highly technical, lots of power, good cardio, and that was the staying power. And great shots straight up the middle. You see the flying knees, you see it in his Tapology picture, but Munir Lazzez has a big fight coming up, and you should definitely check it out. Now, for Abdulrazak Alhassan on the left-hand side, man, I thought this guy had a huge opportunity a couple of years ago before he went away. And for him, his career just kind of stalled out. He couldn't take fights. He was just on the shelf. A guy that was one of those first breakthrough fighters from Fortis MMA to really find a lot of success. You remember the Sabah Homasi fights. I remember where I was in the second Sabah Homasi fight because I was sitting at TD Garden watching the fight. But I looked at him as, wow, this guy really has a huge opportunity because he's a judo black belt. He's got dynamite in his hands. He's a very precise striker. His gas tank wasn't bad, but we didn't really have to see it because all of his 10 wins were by knockout. So he was a guy that was incredibly explosive, and we've seen Jeff Neal kind of take that crown at Fortis MMA and really carry it forward. But for the time, or at the time, 2 years ago, Abdulrazak Alhassan was like that next thing. We saw it in the Lazzez fight. He comes in, he misses weight. I have it up there at 174, and his cardio was bad. I mean, the thing is, though, he had a huge opportunity in that fight, and he shot his shot. He went to shoot a shot, and it didn't work. I mean, he went to pour the gas on Munir Lazzez, and then in the second round, he had nothing left.
Exactly.
Then the fight slipped away.
And I really don't think that's going to happen in this one. I mean, Munir Lazzez, you can say what you want about him. He's more underrated than I think most people realize. And I like what you mentioned. He has that kind of rare combination of he's got phenomenal technique, power, and cardio. And normally you've only got like one, maybe two of those things. And he is fortunate to have all three. Not saying I think Munir Lazzez is going to beat like Usman next week. But I like what you said too about Jeff Neal. Jeff Neal really is kind of the next evolution of who Abdulrazak Alhassan should be. Because when you look at what Alhassan does, he throws a lot of extra techniques that he doesn't really have to. He does the Zabit where he's like, okay, I'm not doing anything. Let's just throw a spin kick. And it works if it lands and if you can cause damage. And even if you catch that on the arm, like if Abdul Razak Al-Hassan's kicking you, you're going to feel it. Luke Rockhold said this like a lot before he had all the leg surgeries, but his theory was always, I'm just going to keep on kicking you. Like, you can block my kicks till the cows come home. I'm either going to hurt your arm or your leg or something. Like, that's just how powerful my kicks are. I think Al-Hassan's similar in that respect, where if he's just throwing kicks to your body, you can block them, and he's going to be more than happy if you just keep your arms there. The power that this man possesses at 170, not that it's unheard of. There's a few guys out there who kind of have that explosiveness, but he is very unique in that aspect. Nico Price, great example. Durability is through the roof. And Abdulrazak Al-Hassan KO'd him in the first round and pretty much the first minute of their fight. Al-Hassan at his best, I agree. I do think the Muay Thai, the explosiveness, and the speed would have been a massive problem for a lot of guys. It did remind me a lot, not in the way that their game is kind of set up, but just in the ceiling of like a Santiago Ponzinibbio, another guy we haven't seen in a very long time, but a guy who you thought that, okay, on his best day, no matter what, whether it's a bad style matchup, he's good enough that he can get you a win. After all that time off, though, and especially after the last performance, I don't now think Abdulrazak Al-Hassan could go out there and beat the Vicente Luques. Of course, he wouldn't fight Jeff Neal, but the Jeff Neals of the world, those guys in that 10 to 15 range that I would like to see him get matched up with, I don't know if he can beat those guys anymore at this stage in his career. He is 35 at 170. 170 is that weird in between. Like, where does age really affect you? Because we know, and it's not just like we're making these stats up. If you're older at heavyweight, you can fight till you're 45. It really doesn't matter. Look at Andre Arlovski. He's 63 and he's still getting off wins. And then you look at guys like Joseph Benavidez at flyweight, who, like, the second they get over 35, you're like, okay, like, time's ticking. We don't have much time doing this. I do think Al-Hassan has the same skill set that he did before the time off. I think a lot of the positives are still there, and I do think it could have been one of those cases, like Fabricio Verdum having his first fight back against Alexander Oleinik, and then fighting Gustafsson afterwards. He lost Oleinik. He didn't look good. But then against Gustafsson, he showed up, looked like he was in amazing shape all of a sudden. It looked phenomenal in that fight. So maybe it was just a case of getting that one under your belt before you show up to your next one. We don't need to argue about Gustafsson's motivation going into that Verdum fight.
Or Verdum's, it was just to get that Bellator bag.
But still, Verdum looked good. And I do think it's a case of, if you take a lot of time off, sometimes you just need to get that one bad performance out of the way. Kind of get yourself readjusted to what, you know, your life what your life is like in the UFC. For Chaos Williams, there's a path to victory. You have as much power as him, and kind of the crisp boxing combinations that he has. You have a chance against anyone, especially against another guy who's a primary striker. But you're dealing with another guy who's a primary striker that I believe is on a much different level than most other guys, especially 170. If you're having a pure kickboxing fight with Abdulrazak Al-Hassan, unless your name is like a Santiago Ponzinibbio or Jorge Masvidal or one of those top guys, if you're just striking with him...
Or Munir Lazzez.
If you're just striking with him, he is always going to be that big problem. Some guys with their volume can kind of stifle him. Some guys with their wrestling can. But if you go out there and fight Abdulrazak Al-Hassan in the same style that Chaos Williams fights, which is like Al-Hassan, you're probably just going to end up getting knocked out. I do think Chaos Williams can apply the pressure really well. I do think that if he can extend Razak Al-Hassan past that first round and a half, I'll say that 7-minute mark is kind of where the power starts to get drained. And if Williams can keep his cardio up, can really attack the leg and the body of Al-Hassan early on, I think as the fight progresses, he can start to take over. I just don't really see it happening that way. I think of the short sample size we've been able to see him in the UFC, it's great to look at a guy and see him get this really fast knockout in his UFC debut and be like, wow, look at all these positives. It was a case, though, I think he just caught Moreno. Now, maybe they run that fight back and he wins 10 times out of 10 times. But just that one fight, he kind of catches them early. They're a little cold, and then he finishes them. It shows that he has great power and great finishing instinct, but I didn't learn a lot else about his game in that one. So I'm just going to have to pick the more confident pick in this with Abdulrazak Al-Hassan.
I really like Chaos Williams in that fight. I really like how, again, he really went after it quick. He didn't land that 3-punch flurry where he was planning. I can't stress this enough. It was almost like trying to hit a baseball on a tee, but he swung up near his head, he swung down on and hit the tee, and then they all missed. All three of them missed totally.
Still knocked the guy out in under 30 seconds.
Really planted, and then he moved forward and started to catch him. And as soon as he recognized that he caught him, he went straight in for that finish. And let's say, I don't know, let's just guess and say 25% of all those punches hit. Well, it didn't matter because there was so much power on the end of them. Chaos Williams is definitely a guy that you have to watch out for, and maybe he has that trajectory of a Munir Lazzez. He got his one loss out of the way early, and I say early, it was back in 2018 against Dan Yates, but again, knockout win, decision, knockout win, decision, submission against Ladarius Jackson, knockout over Bo Yan, Then he gets a decision win over Jeremy Holloway, and then the win over Alex Morono. There's certainly a shot for Chaos Williams. If there was a pop and popcorn type of fight, this is it. This is a performance bonus waiting to happen. And oh, by the way, they've got a new co-main event. Now, if we have a look at the odds, Matt, on this fight, you're talking about a Munir Lazzez that's coming in. He lost his last time out. He is still a decent-sized favorite. Open to minus 175. That line's dropped to about minus 229 over on Best Fight Odds. For Chaos Williams, open to plus 135. He's now plus 186. If we look at the total votes over on Tapology, 357 votes, 62% going with Abdulrazak Alhassan, 87% saying he's going to win by knockout. For Chaos Williams, 38% of voters picking him, 76% of those voters saying that he's going to win by knockout. A lot of people think a knockout in this one.
You'll rarely see those numbers that high.
You really do rarely see it. Listen, great stylistic matchup. If Abdulrazak Alhassan comes back again in like final form, like we saw Verdum against Gustafsson, yeah, I think he could certainly pick up the win. If Chaos Williams just stands back a little bit, stays long on his punches, maybe he has a good opportunity here. I think that judo is an X factor for Abdulrazak Alhassan. I think he's going to want to take this fight to the mat. I know it extends a lot of energy, or expends a lot of energy rather, but I think that's probably the best path. And once you get that to the ground, just start to hammer away. And that's probably the best method of victory, because you don't want to stand and try and bang with Chaos Williams early. You saw what happened in Williams' fight with Morono.
I mean, you might not want him to do that. I definitely want him to do that, just for excitement value. This fight would be crazy if they just decided, okay, we're going to Ricardo Lamas, Max Holloway, and let's just throw. Not going to happen, of course. One guy throws kicks, and a lot of them. The other guy's primarily boxing-oriented. Now, if you are such a good boxer, you can kind of get past the kicking range. We're talking about this before the video started. Full circle with Matt and Craig. Fedor did that against Mirko Cro Cop, and that was kind of the first time that people realized, hey, if some guy's really good at kicking, it's almost like the closer you are is an advantage, because you crowd all that space. The problem is if Chaos Williams decides to do that, then you're boxing with Abdulrazak Alhassan, who has insane explosiveness, power, and speed. So it's really one of those, either Alhassan wins in the first round and one of the greatest knockouts you've seen of this year, or Chaos Williams, he could do that, or he is able to kind of drain that power bar and make it a bit of an ugly fight and look for the finish late. I'm very excited for this one. I'm kind of regretting I didn't pick it as my fight of the night, but I am going to pick Abdulrazak Alhassan. That's something I won't regret.
Matt, we both have Abdulrazak Alhassan in this fight. It is pop and popcorn. It's performance bonus waiting to happen. I'm really looking forward to it. We have an interesting card that's going to develop during the week, so you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. Toss in the sub with the notifications on if you'd like. We'd appreciate it. And Matt, as we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Big time shift in our main event of the evening. The Irish Dragon, Paul Felder, stepping in on short notice to take on RDA, Rafael Dos Anjos, stepping in for Islam Makhachev. And Matt, the originally slated main event would have been a very interesting fight, because you had Dos Anjos moving back down from 170 pounds to the division that he once ruled as the former lightweight champ. And I mean, Matt, I feel like we never really got to see the full extent of what Rafael Dos Anjos could have done at 155 pounds. He became the champ, and then he had that fight against Eddie Alvarez, and he was no longer champ. We missed out on the fight with Conor McGregor, and it just left a legacy that kind of leaves you scratching your head. He fought a lot of the top competition at 155 pounds and 170 pounds, and he picked up big wins in both divisions. I mean, a lot of people like to point to the fight that he had in the main event back in UFC Winnipeg when he beat Robbie Lawler. Like, how crazy was that fight? Rafael Dos Anjos is kind of like a tiny buzzsaw. Just so happens that he's either fighting out of Gracie Barra HQ or King's MMA or Ruka Sport. But he's been in Southern California for a very long time, training with a great stablemate of talent. And we look at the man on the left-hand side, Matt, that really saved this card. And I mean, kudos to Paul Felder. A, company man. B, when he's on his weeks off, he is one thick boy, and of course, that has to be a talking point. I know RDA is moving down from 70 back to 155 pounds. If you look at the pictures of Rafael Dos Anjos over on the Instagram, dude, shred city. Dude's actually in very, very good shape. I hate using the word dude, but you look at Rafael Dos Anjos, and he looks bricked up and ready for the transition down to 55. He said it as much over on the social medias. He was entertaining a fight at 70, so it'll be interesting to see where this fight slots in. I mean, hey, this fight was just announced. We already happened to be taping the breakdowns and finishing up on the things that we had from yesterday before the Makhachev fight was canceled. But this fight's an awesome one because you have two guys that are kind of in the later stages of their career. You have to say that. Paul Felder, 36 years of age. Same thing for Rafael Dos Anjos. And Matt, the weird thing, and this is the narrative I want to take with this one, is the fact that Rafael dos Anjos was moving back down to 155 pounds to be taking on the number 12 ranked lightweight in Islam Makhachev. Now he gets the number 7 ranked Paul Felder. What's in it for Paul Felder to take a fight like this?
Because you don't become the BMF of the UFC by beating Nate Diaz in front of The Rock. You become the BMF of the UFC by fighting RDA on 5 days' notice, willing to cut who knows how much weight Paul Felder's going to have to cut, but still accepting the fact that he's going to fight RDA, the former champ, at 155 on 5 days' notice in a fight that's still going to be 5 rounds, which is really important because we've seen, as of late, especially during these pandemic times, the UFC's kind of just had to rush to put some main events together. Rakic, Alexander Smith was only a 3-round main event.
Anthony Smith?
Anthony Smith, sorry. Derek Brunson, Edmund Shabazian, another 3-round main event. So the UFC has made exceptions, recently, but Paul Felder's saying, no, like, main event, 25 minutes, let's go for it. Stylistically, this is such a fun fight too, but before we get into that, Islam Makhachev is by far the biggest loser out of all this, because let's say RDA comes down and he is able to beat Paul Felder. Well, Paul Felder's in that weird kind of purgatory, if you will, of his career where is he an active fighter? Is he just doing the commentary stuff, kind of helping out at the gym? He's sort of, to me, in that James Krause category where it's, I'll fight when I want to fight, but Paul Felder has a little bit more of a name than James Krause, so I'm sure he's fishing for those bigger names. And I mean, this is it. Like, the fact that Paul Felder's doing this is just insane. I'm still kind of trying to get over that. But Islam, if RDA beats Paul Felder, who still has a number next to his name, he's going to be in that top 10 range. And I really doubt he's going to want to go backwards to fight Islam Makhachev that he was a 4-1 underdog against. So, and then if Paul Felder wins, well, he's already sort of and I hate to use this term, but I do think it applies. He's kind of a part-time fighter right now. So I really doubt he wants to fight a stylistic nightmare in Islam Makhachev just to be, on like the main card of a pay-per-view. So, unfortunate for Islam Makhachev, but I gotta be honest, this fight is going to be fireworks. I'm more excited for this fight than I was the RDA Islam Makhachev fight, because in that fight, you know what you're gonna get. You're gonna get Islam trying to take down RDA for the majority of it, and then if RDA, we kind of see, is the takedown defense better at 155 than it was at 170? You kind of hope so if you're a fan of his. We don't need to worry about any of that now. It's gonna be RDA in sort of that volume kind of firefight that we know that he's really capable in. And the thing that I'm excited for, we saw a lot of clinch work out of RDA in that Robbie Lawler fight, and Paul Felder not afraid to get bloody in the clinch, so I do think that this makes for a very violent and very entertaining main event.
And it's a lot better that we actually get a striker on the left-hand side, or a guy that's primarily known as a striker, because with Islam Makhachev, you have that ground game, you have that wrestling, and RDA, for the longest time, has struggled with the bigger guys, especially guys that are going for those volume and chain-heavy takedowns. With Paul Felder, you're not necessarily going to get that. And for Paul Felder, again, like you said, he's the type of guy that if we look at his recent record, I mean, we're talking one fight in 2020 against Dan Hooker. That was an absolute war. The fight against Edson Barboza at UFC 242 was as well. So that's back in August of 2019. Before that, a win over James Vick. Before that, in 2018, a fight against Mike Perry at 170 pounds. He loses that one by split decision, fighting with a broken arm partway through. And then before that, a stack of 3 wins. Alex Ricci, Stevie Ray, and Charles Oliveira. Matt, we happen to be in the building for the Alex Ricci win. That was kind of crazy back at UFC Halifax. But you look at that for Paul Felder, and I'm looking at the quality of the fights. The Charles Oliveira win's huge. That was before Oliveira went on this huge run that he's been on lately. The Mike Perry fight, a bit of a toss-up. Again, you move up to 170, you take the fight, you break your arm, you still have a competitive go. Yeah. James Vick, at the time, was a decent win. I mean, I still scratch my head a little bit on that one. No longer in the UFC. And the Barboza and Hooker wins the win against Barboza and the loss to Dan Hooker, those were toss-up fights. And for Paul Felder, again, to be ranked 7th in the division, little bit of a head-scratcher. And he's in a tough spot because it's not like Paul Felder's going to go in tomorrow and have a fight against Tony Ferguson. But you never know, right? It's not like he's going to have It's not like he's going to have a fight against Ali Quinta. But you never know. Well, ultimately, apparently, he's been waiting on the sidelines, and he gets a shot at Rafael dos Anjos.
So, RDA, at this stage of his career, there is 2 different sides to him. We have seen a lot of the takedown defense out of RDA as of late, and it's not great. But that's because he's fighting Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, Michael Chiesa, like primary grapplers. And I know Chiesa was a 155 and he moved up to 170, but I think we can all agree, physically, Michael Chiesa is a much bigger person than Rafael dos Anjos. And he was able to kind of employ the same game plan that those 2 previous wrestlers were against RDA. Make him tired. Just go for as many takedown attempts as possible, force him on the defense. The one thing I don't like from RDA, I feel like he's further into his golf game than Paul Felder is, even though Paul Felder realizes that he is kind of in that retired stage, if that makes any sense. Like Paul Felder, he's kind of setting himself up for what he's going to do after fighting. He realizes he doesn't have that many left. RDA still thinks that he can get to the title shot eventually, and the problem I have is his striking, I do think, has sort of regressed as of late. He used to be a really good pressure striker. He was always moving forward. We saw that a little bit in the Covington fight. I do think that was the last good RDA performance, even though he was on the losing end, because he did put up a really good fight against Colby Covington. I highly recommend you go back and watch that fight. Covington won the fight, don't get me wrong, but RDA took Covington down. He outstruck him for periods, and he did look good. But after that fight, we haven't really seen that same style of striking. If you can back Rafael dos Anjos up, he does get into a bit of a defensive shell. And if this is a Paul Felder, I'm going to say at 100%. I understand he's not going to be because he didn't have a camp. Who knows the toll that the weight cut's going to take? There are a lot of question marks. But let's say Paul Felder is as close to 100% as we can predict. If Paul Felder can back up RDA, he's going to be a nightmare for him. He checks leg kicks, something that RDA throws a lot of. And RDA used that to really good effect against Neil Magny, who... I'm going to compare this fight to that a lot because Neil Magny, another really good striker, super dangerous on the feet, I would say doesn't have the power Paul Felder or maybe some of the, crazier techniques with the elbows, but still a very accurate striker who has a high volume and high work rate. RDA just chopped his legs down, eventually took full mount, and then got him into a head and arm choke. The jiu-jitsu of RDA, if he is able to take Paul Felder down, and I'm assuming that's what his game plan is going to be, is kind of on another level, and that does worry me for Paul Felder. We saw Charles Oliveira, although he wasn't able to submit Paul Felder, he had him in some terrible positions throughout that fight. He had him in that Darce, it could have been Anaconda, and he almost had him tapped out, and he was able to get Paul Felder in a lot of compromising positions. Now, the good news is, Paul Felder did get out of all of those and ended up TKOing Oliveira on the ground, which is a very impressive feat, but RDA isn't going to have the same style where he's comfortable off of his back like Oliveira, where he's susceptible to being hit. If Paul Felder does get top control on RDA is constantly going to be trying to sweep and get on top himself, so I don't think it's going to allow Paul Felder a lot of time in top position to really posture up and land some of that great ground and pound, because Paul Felder, I mean, Hellbows are a real term, and I think he brings them to the octagon just as good as anyone. Stevie Ray, say what you want about him, but the TKO over him was extremely violent. Tie clinch into a knee and then a bunch of ground and pound elbows. I mean, that is kind of the bread and butter game of Paul Felder. And if RDA decides to just stand in front of him and try to make this into kind of a Muay Thai kickboxing fight, I think Paul Felder has a very good chance of winning. The issue, though, is I don't know where Paul Felder's takedown defense is without a full camp. I know with a full camp, if he's 100%, he's got kind of that Thiago Santos pre-ACL surgery takedown defense where he's really good at exploding and then getting out of the way. He can do that to good effect. But the fact that he hasn't had a lot of time to prepare for a guy like RDA, who is going to require you to have the best cardio of your career, because by round 5, if RDA is not getting taken down 1,000 times, he's going to be there. He's going to be throwing still a really high work rate. So as much as I want to side with Paul Felder in this fight, it's really hard to not pick the guy who's had a full camp and expected to fight this weekend.
And I mean, that's it. You look at Paul Felder, and again, you want to go through those wins. You look at the fight that he had, a fight of the night against Dan Hooker.
I thought he beat Dan Hooker.
That was in a main event. You're definitely not alone in that one.
I thought he lost Edson Barboza, though. That was the thing.
It was a split decision. So, I mean, yes, I thought that realistically Barboza won the fight against Felder. I thought that ultimately Hooker won the fight against Felder. But again, that one could go either way.
Very close fight.
James Vick fight, definitely a good one for him. You look at the fights that he's been taken down, though. He's been taken down by Hooker. He's been taken down by Barboza. You get taken down by Mike Perry. You get taken down by Oliveira. Francisco Trinaldo, Massaranduba, Josh Berkman. Love the beard, not so much the fights. Darren Cruikshank, Ross Pearson.
I don't think he
and Jason Sago, if we go all the way back to his fight in 2014. Yes, again, you can't really look too much into that. The other thing, too, with Paul Felder, he's continued to make advancements in his game to the point where he's the 7th-ranked lightweight in one of the most stacked divisions, though it's getting a little bit thinner. And, I mean, at this point, he continues to progress in Roufusport. I mean, that's such a good gym. We talk about Brendan Allen taking on this big fight against Sean Strickland. We talk about Gerald Mearshart being one of those leaders there. Forget about the Hamzat Chimaev fight. From a jiu-jitsu standpoint, he definitely stands firm. With Paul Felder, we continue to see bits and pieces added to his game. But the big thing with Paul Felder that he's known for, it's an intangible that's not going to jump off the page. It's one of those things that two nerds on the computer, it's easy for me to say this. The guy's toughness and his heart.
Oh my God.
And that's something that you can't quantify. You're not going to see it in any form of MMA math or analytics. Paul Felder is one of the toughest SOBs out there. Like, this guy comes to fight. For him to take this fight on short notice, for him to want it to be a 5-round main event, does not surprise me in the least.
BMF.
And I know, Matt, that you and I thought, well, maybe Beneil Dariush should get this opportunity. Yes, there was a bit of a, obviously, King's MMA thing with Dos Anjos. They probably didn't want to fight. We also threw out Drew Dober. And I know Dober was supposed to have a fight against Carlos Diego Ferreira on this date. Fajea pulled out of that fight, but then threw his name into the hat of, yeah, I'll fight Dos Anjos, why not? So there was a lot of people that it could have been. Ultimately, we get Paul Felder from Dos Anjos. Again, you're training for a 5-round fight that you knew was going to be a 5-round fight. You're Shred City coming down from 170 to 155. You've been putting in good rounds at Gracie Baja HQ. Again, the Kings connection, the Ruka Sport connection with everybody's old pal, Jason Perillo. Douche! I'm really looking forward to this fight. Ultimately, if it was 100% both guys, it would be a really tough fight to try and figure out. Because for Dos Anjos, you have 20 more professional fights, and you still have the mindset of, I want to go out there and be a champion. What the hell is Paul Felder's mindset? I've already set myself up with a UFC commentating gig. I take 1 or 2 fights a year, and they're incredibly competitive.
If he wins this, though, he's an absolute legend.
I'm a huge company man. And I mean, hey, I'm eager to see, again, like you had mentioned, the line on this fight. Because originally, yes, Islam Makhachev was a very big favorite against Dos Anjos. Understandable. I mean, we hadn't even taped the pick. We were about halfway through, and then the fight fell out. So then we recorded an intro, and then that fell out. And then we recorded an intro today, and that doesn't matter anymore. So we are where we're at right now. If I had to guess, I would think that the odds are probably going to be close to par. I really do. I don't think it would be crazy if maybe Dos Anjos is actually a little bit of a favorite, just ever so slightly, like minus 120, minus 125.
Like 2-1 RDA.
No. But ultimately, I think this is going to be a competitive fight until it gets like halfway through the second into the third. And then it's going to be overwhelmingly RDA.
It's going to be a lot of kind of Jorge Masvidal against Usman. You saw in the first round of their fight, Masvidal was able to explode, land some good combos, and you're like, hey, he might actually be able to win this. And then kind of as the fight progressed, there's a reason you have training camps. You don't just jump into fights for no reason, unless you're Kevin Holland, I guess, or Angela Hill. But Paul Felder, doing this on 5 days' notice, again, you can't say enough great things about the guy. Really high fight IQ, too. That goes along with defensively, he is really sound. He has a really high guard. He is going to be able to absorb and deflect a lot of the shots RDA gives him. It's just the wrestling and the grappling side of things. I do think with a full training camp, Paul Felder would be able to at least game plan a little bit and have a few different, sweeps and techniques to maybe give RDA some trouble on the ground. Unless he does crack him with a big shot or maybe catch him coming in trying to take him down, I don't see this for Paul Felder. It would be insane if he could go out there, just, Muay Thai clinch, elbow RDA, knock him out, and then retire. That'd be a great way to go out, but I really doubt it's going to happen. I'm going to side with RDA. It is a good fight to take, though, if you're Paul Felder, because RDA, at this stage of his career, there are a lot of question marks, and let's say his striking is to the point where he's so defensive that if you can start backing him up, you can start landing good combos. If Paul Felder is on his front foot and RDA is kind of backing up, eating shots, Paul Felder could TKO him. Like, he does have that kind of power. So it is a really volatile fight, if you will, because Paul Felder does have such a good chance to win with the crazy amount of power he has, but it's just hard to pick against RDA.
And I mean, if you look at Paul Felder, just maybe even one slight knock, the striking defense, 49%, you have a good enough sample size, strikes absorbed per minute, 3.4, and then you look at the takedown defense at 61%. He's not necessarily going for the takedowns, but he's susceptible to getting taken down. And I went through the list of the guys, and hey, that number's weighted a little bit by Jason Sago, Canada's own, Prince Edward Island's own Jason Sago. But again, with Paul Felder, he's liable to get hit. But if you hit him with 2 or 3 just pot shots, he's going to hit you with 1 or 2 really hard shots that you have to worry about. And there's a lot of straight shots up the middle. Now, we've talked about that a lot recently, that Brian Ortega, you find that elbow up the middle. Paul Felder's a good guy to watch for a lot of those type of shots. Straight shots straight up the middle. He can throw the hooks as well. With Dos Anjos, if it's going to be a win for Dos Anjos, a lot of volume and a lot of pressure. And I really like what I've seen out of Dos Anjos as far as the social medias are concerned. I know you don't want to put too much stock into stuff like that. And if you look at Dos Anjos' strength of schedule, if we can really talk about it just quickly, you look at this guy's last 5 fights. Colby Covington, Kamaru Usman. Interim champ, full-time champ at welterweight. Kevin Lee, and he beat him by arm triangle in a fight that he looked amazing in that fight. Good. Loses to Leon Edwards, who was your number 3 ranked welterweight, and loses to Michael Chiesa, a blown-up lightweight who's found a lot of success at welterweight. None of those names are easy, including Kevin Lee. And then before that, you beat the former Strikeforce champion, Tarek Saffiedine. Tarek, where you at? He beat Neil Magny, and he beat Robbie Lawler, your former champ at 170. So, I mean, for Dos Anjos, we're taking on tough names. And even that Saffiedine fight, we're talking back over 3 years ago to this point. So, for Dos Anjos, I expect a win here. Again, the line probably maybe somewhere around par, maybe slightly favoring one of these guys. But ultimately, I'm really looking forward to this fight. It should be really competitive. Kudos to the company man, Paul Felder, for taking it. We're both going to side with Rafael Dos Anjos in this one. Matt, Now, I'm really looking forward to this card. We've got a great main event. Brendan Allen is taking on a really tough test in Sean Strickland. There's great fights throughout, so make sure you check out the rest of the playlist for these videos. Keep locked in with Fight Night Picks. If fights fall out or if fights are added this week, you check in here, you hang out with us. Toss us up. Toss a like. See, I stutter to say it because I hate doing it, but we really appreciate everybody out there. This channel's grown a lot, just even in the past couple of weeks, so we really do appreciate everybody out there. Matt, as we always say, with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it.